The UFO that punched a hole in the sky above Chicago, November 7th, 2006. 4:14 in the afternoon. Gate C-17, one of the busiest airports in the world. And then, without warning, time seemed to stop for a dozen trained aviation professionals who would never forget what they saw hanging in the sky above them. Introduction. The moment everything changed. November 7th, 2006 started like any other Tuesday at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The afternoon shift was in full swing. Mechanics crawled under aircraft bellies checking hydraulic lines. Ramp workers guided incoming flights with orange batons. Pilots reviewed flight plans in cockpits that smelled of coffee and aviation fuel. More than 200 aircraft were scheduled to move through O'Hare that afternoon, each one a carefully choreographed dance of metal, fuel, and human precision. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of grey clouds sitting at about 1,800 feet. Perfect flying weather for commercial aviation. Terrible weather for what was about to happen. At 4:14 in the afternoon, a United Airlines mechanic named Thomas Wilkins was walking across the tarmac near Gate C-17 when something made him stop. Later, he would struggle to explain what drew his attention upward. There was no sound, no flash of light, no warning whatsoever. But when he looked up, his world tilted on its axis. Hovering silently above Gate C-17, approximately 1,500 feet in the air, was an object that should not have existed. It was a disc, perfectly round, metallic grey, and it was not moving. Wilkins had been working at O'Hare for 17 years. He had seen everything the sky could throw at an airport. Birds migrating in massive flocks that sometimes interfered with radar. Weather balloons drifting lazily through restricted airspace. Small private planes that wandered off course and caused brief moments of panic in the control tower. He had even seen a parachutist once, years ago, who had miscalculated his landing zone and nearly collided with the departing 737. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The object was positioned directly above Gate C-17, one of the busiest gates at one of the busiest airports in the world. Below it, a United Airlines Boeing 757 was being prepared for departure to Los Angeles. Ground crew were loading luggage. Fuel trucks were disconnecting their hoses. Passengers were settling into their seats, stuffing carry-on bags into overhead compartments, completely unaware that something impossible was hovering 1,000 feet above their heads. The colour of the object was distinctive. Not silver like polished aluminum, not white like most aircraft. It was a dark metallic grey, almost gunmetal, with a matte finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. In the overcast afternoon light, it looked almost like a hole in the sky itself, a darker shape against the already grey clouds. Wilkins stood frozen, his clipboard hanging loose in his hand. Around him, the airport continued its mechanical symphony. Jet engines whined, ground crews shouted coordinates, luggage carts beeped in reverse. But above all of it, suspended in complete silence, was something that made every law of physics he understood seem suddenly negotiable. He grabbed the radio clip to his belt. His voice cracked as he called it in. Within seconds, others were looking up. Within minutes, more than a dozen United Airlines employees, pilots, mechanics, gate agents, and ground crew would become witnesses to something that would haunt them for years. Something that would force the Federal Aviation Administration to issue official statements. Something that would make headlines around the world for exactly one day before vanishing into the machinery of bureaucratic denial. This is the story of the O'Hare incident. A story about trained professionals who saw something impossible. A story about an object that defied every known principle of flight. And a story about what happens when the unexplainable collides with an institution that cannot afford to acknowledge it. Act 1. The Witness Cascade. The first witness was Thomas Wilkins, but he would not be the last, not by a long shot. Within 3 minutes of Wilkins' initial sighting, 5 more ground crew members had stopped what they were doing and were staring upward. Then came the pilots. Captain Raymond Hollingsworth was in the cockpit of United Flight 893. preparing for departure to Denver, when his first officer tapped his shoulder and pointed out the window. Hollingsworth was a 23-year veteran of commercial aviation. He had logged over 15,000 hours in the air. He had flown through hurricanes, electrical storms and equipment failures that would make passengers' blood freeze. He was not a man easily rattled, but when he looked out his cockpit window and saw what was hovering above Gate C-17, his mouth went dry. The first thought that went through his mind was threat assessment. Was this object a danger to his aircraft, to his passengers, to the airport? He had been trained to identify threats, to categorize them, to respond appropriately. But this object did not fit into any category he knew. It was not moving toward them. It was not showing any hostile intent. It was just there, hanging in the air like someone had painted it onto the sky. His first officer, a younger pilot named Jennifer Nakamura, was equally transfixed. She had pulled out her phone and was trying to take a picture, but the angle from the cockpit window was poor, and the distance was too great. The image she captured would later show nothing more than a dark smudge against grey clouds. But both pilots knew what they were looking at was no smudge. It was solid. It was real. And it was unlike anything either of them had ever seen. The object was approximately 25 to 30 feet in diameter. That was the consensus among witnesses, though some estimates ran as high as 40 feet. It was disc-shaped, almost perfectly circular. The colour was consistent across every witness account, dark metallic grey, like gunmetal or brushed steel. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no markings of any kind, no windows, no lights, no visible means of propulsion, and it was not moving, at all. This point cannot be overstated. The object was not drifting, it was not bobbing, it was not rotating. It hung in the air with the absolute stillness of something nailed to the sky itself. Pilots know what helicopters look like when they hover. They know what drones look like. They know what weather balloons look like. This was none of those things. Helicopters hover with a characteristic slight wobble, constantly making micro-adjustments to maintain position. Their rotor wash creates visible disturbances in the air below them, kicking up dust and debris on the ground. Drones, even large military drones, have visible propellers or rotors. Weather balloons drift with air currents, never maintaining a perfectly fixed position. This object exhibited none of these characteristics. It was as motionless as a building, except buildings do not float 1,500 feet in the air. The thickness of the disc was harder to judge from ground level, but witnesses estimated it to be somewhere between 3 and 6 feet at its thickest point. The edges appeared to be slightly thinner than the centre, giving it a classic flying saucer profile. Some witnesses described it as looking almost like 2 dinner plates pressed together rim to rim. Aviation mechanic David Schultz had worked at O'Hare for 11 years. He was standing near the de-icing station when the call came over the radio. He walked to a position where he could see Gate C-17 and stopped dead in his tracks. Years later, in an interview with a Chicago television station, he would describe what he saw. The object looked solid, not translucent, not shimmering, solid, like something you could reach out and touch if you could get close enough. It had depth and dimension. It occupied space. Whatever it was physically there, hanging in restricted airspace above one of the busiest airports in the world. Schultz was trained in aircraft identification. Part of his job involved recognizing different types of aircraft from a distance, understanding their capabilities and limitations. He could identify a Boeing 747 from a 757 at a glance. He could tell the difference between an Airbus A320 and a Boeing 737 from their silhouettes. But this object matched no silhouette he had ever seen in any manual, any training session, or any experience in his 11 years at O'Hare. The surface of the disc appeared to be seamless. In modern aircraft manufacturing, you can always see the panels, the access hatches, the joints where different sections of the fuselage come together. This object had none of that. It looked as if it had been formed from a single piece of material, whatever that material was. The matte grey finish gave it an almost organic quality, as if it had grown rather than been built. Gate Supervisor Janet Thornton was inside the terminal when the first report started coming in. She walked outside onto the observation deck and immediately saw it. Her first thought was that it was some kind of advertising stunt. Her second thought was that whoever authorised this stunt was going to lose their job. Her third thought was that it was not a stunt. Nothing about it made sense as a stunt. Thornton had been a gate supervisor for 9 years. She had seen her share of unusual incidents. Celebrities trying to board planes without proper identification. Passengers attempting to smuggle exotic pets in carry-on luggage. Emergency landings that filled the terminal with the smell of burnt rubber. But she had never seen anything like this. She pulled out her radio and tried to get clarification from the control tower. The response was confused and unhelpful. Yes, they were aware of something over gate C-17. No, they did not know what it was. No, it was not showing up on radar. How could something that large not show up on radar? Thornton stared at the object, trying to make sense of it. The airport's radar systems were sophisticated enough to track birds. They could detect turbulence. They could identify incoming storms. But this metallic disc, this object large enough to be visible from the ground with the naked eye, was apparently invisible to their most advanced detection equipment. A passenger tapped her on the shoulder. The woman was elderly, probably in her 70s, and she was pointing at the sky. "Do you see that?" she asked. Thornton nodded. The passenger asked if it was a new type of aircraft. Thornton did not know what to say. She settled for a non-committal response about checking with operations. But inside she was as confused and unsettled as anyone else watching the impossible object hanging in the sky. By 4:20 in the afternoon, at least 12 United Airlines employees had confirmed visual contact with the object. They were not all standing in the same place. They were scattered across different areas of the airport, different vantage points, different angles. But they were all looking at the same thing. A metallic disc hovering silently above gate C-17. Someone contacted the control tower. The tower confirmed that they were not tracking anything unusual on radar. The object was either invisible to radar or too small to register, though neither explanation made sense given its reported size and metallic composition. Someone else contacted the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA's initial response was dismissive. They suggested it was likely a weather balloon or a small private aircraft. But the witnesses knew what they were seeing was neither of those things. And then, at approximately 4:28 in the afternoon, the object moved. It did not fly away, it did not drift, it did not bank or turn or accelerate gradually like any known aircraft would do. What it did was something that would be corroborated by every single witness who saw it happen. Something that would become the defining characteristic of the O'Hare incident. The disc shot straight up, instantaneously, vertically, with no visible acceleration phase. One moment it was hovering motionless. The next moment it was gone, punching through the cloud layer at a speed that no one could accurately estimate, because it happened too fast for the human eye to track. Several witnesses would later describe a sense of disorientation in that moment. The human brain is designed to track moving objects. We can follow a baseball through the air. We can watch a jet accelerate down a runway. We understand motion as a continuous process. But what happened at O'Hare that afternoon violated that understanding. The object did not move through space in any conventional sense. It was simply in one location, and then it was in another location, with no perceptible transition between the two states. And where it had been, where it had torn through the clouds, there was now a hole. A perfectly circular hole in the overcast sky. Clean edges, geometric precision, like someone had taken a giant hole punch and cut a perfect circle out of the cloud layer. The hole stayed there for several minutes, clearly visible to everyone watching, before the clouds slowly began to fill it in. The size of the hole matched the diameter of the object almost exactly. Witnesses estimated it to be between 25 and 35 feet across. The edges were sharp and defined, not fuzzy or indistinct like you would expect from a natural cloud formation. It looked artificial, deliberate, as if the object had carved its exit path through the cloud layer with surgical precision. Thomas Wilkins stood on the tarmac, staring up at the hole. Around him, The normal sounds of airport operations were slowly resuming. Jet engines, hydraulic lifts, the beeping of reversing vehicles. But for a few moments, everything had stopped. Everyone who had seen the object depart was standing in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Pilots who had seen it happen were standing on the tarmac in stunned silence. Ground crew members were looking at each other, trying to find words for what they had just witnessed. Gate agents inside the terminal were pressing their faces against windows, searching the sky for any sign of the object that had just defied every principle of aerodynamics they had ever learned. Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who had first spotted the object, was still standing near Gate C-17. He looked at the hole in the clouds. Then he looked at his clipboard. Then he looked back at the hole. His hands were shaking. The O'Hare incident had lasted approximately 14 minutes. 14 minutes that would change the lives of everyone who witnessed it. 14 minutes that would raise questions that would never be adequately answered. Act 2. Whistleblowers break protocol. The moment the object disappeared, the machinery of institutional control began to grind into motion. United Airlines management moved quickly. Within an hour of the sighting, employees were being told not to speak to anyone about what they had seen. No media, no family members, no one outside the company. The official position was that the matter was under investigation and that any public statements would jeopardize that investigation. For most of the witnesses, this directive created an impossible situation. They had just seen something extraordinary, something that challenged their understanding of what was possible, and now they were being told to stay silent about it. Some complied, others did not. The gag order felt wrong to many of the witnesses. They were not military personnel dealing with classified information. They were civilian employees who had witnessed something in public airspace at a civilian airport. What possible justification could there be for silencing them? The official answer was liability. The unofficial truth was more complicated. United Airlines did not want the publicity. They did not want passengers asking questions. They did not want reporters swarming the airport. And most of all, they did not want to acknowledge that something unexplained had been hovering over one of their gates for 14 minutes, while the company's security and management did nothing about it. But silence is difficult to maintain when a dozen people know the same secret. And when one of those people decided to reach out to the media, the entire carefully constructed wall of denial began to crack. On November the 8th, the day after the incident, Chicago Tribune reporter John Hilkovich received an anonymous tip. Someone from United Airlines wanted to talk. Someone who had been there. Someone who had seen it. Hilkovich was an experienced aviation reporter. He had covered O'Hare for years. He knew how airports worked. He knew the culture of aviation, the protocols, the chain of command. He also knew that when multiple employees from a major airline risk their careers to go on record about something, it is worth investigating. The first meeting took place in a parking lot 3 miles from the airport. The witness was nervous, constantly checking over their shoulder, speaking in hushed tones despite the fact that they were alone. The story that emerged was consistent with what Hilkovich would hear from other witnesses in the days that followed. A metallic disc, no sound, no visible propulsion, hovering motionless for approximately 14 minutes, and then the instantaneous vertical departure that left a hole in the clouds. Hilkovich took notes. He asked clarifying questions. He pressed for details that could be independently verified. The witness was remarkably precise. Times, locations, weather conditions, the position of the sun, the flight that was being loaded at Gate C-17, every detail checked out. This was not someone spinning a fantasy. This was someone describing what they had actually seen. The first witness he spoke with was a United Airlines pilot who insisted on anonymity. The pilot's description was precise and technical. The object was disc-shaped, metallic, approximately 30 feet in diameter. It showed no visible means of propulsion. It made no sound. It did not drift or rotate. And when it departed, it shot straight up through the clouds so fast that it left a visible hole that persisted for several minutes. Hilkovich pressed for details. How fast did it move? The pilot struggled to quantify it. Faster than anything I have ever seen, he said. Jets accelerate, missiles accelerate. This thing did not accelerate. It was stationary and then it was gone. There was no in between. A second witness came forward, a ground crew supervisor, then a third, a mechanic. Each one corroborated the same basic facts. Each one risked disciplinary action or termination by speaking out. Each one felt compelled to do it anyway. One pilot, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Hilkovich something that would become one of the most quoted lines from the entire incident. It was a perfect disc, the pilot said. It did not fly away. It shot straight up. It cut a hole in the clouds. Clean. Like something solid punching through tissue paper. The story broke on January 1st, 2007. Nearly 2 months after the actual incident. The Chicago Tribune ran it as a front-page story. The headline read, "Officials investigating UFO sighting at O'Hare." Within hours, the story had been picked up by national media. CNN ran it. CBS News covered it. For one day, the O'Hare incident was the biggest story in America. The timing of the story's publication was deliberate. Hilkovich had spent nearly 2 months investigating, verifying witness accounts, and attempting to get official responses from United Airlines and the FAA. Both organisations had stonewalled him. United claimed they had no knowledge of any incident. The FAA claimed they had no record of any unusual activity at O'Hare on November 7th. It was only when Hilkovich informed them that he had multiple named sources willing to go on record that the official position began to shift. The FAA was forced to respond. Their initial statement was brief and dismissive. The agency said it had no record of the incident, no radar data, no official reports. As far as the FAA was concerned, nothing had happened at O'Hare on November 7th, 2006. But the witnesses would not go away. More employees came forward, more details emerged, the pressure mounted. And finally, reluctantly, the FAA issued a second statement. This time they acknowledged that something had been reported, but they attributed it to weather phenomena. Specifically, they claimed that a hole punch cloud, a legitimate meteorological phenomenon, had been observed over O'Hare that afternoon. The problem with this explanation was that it made no sense. Hole punch clouds occur at high altitude when supercooled water droplets freeze and fall, creating a circular gap in the cloud layer. They do not occur at 1,800 feet. They are not caused by disc-shaped metallic objects hovering in place and then shooting upward at impossible speeds. And they certainly are not witnessed by a dozen trained aviation professionals who all describe the same thing. The explanation was so transparently inadequate that it actually drew more attention to the incident. Aviation forums exploded with discussion. Pilots from around the country weighed in, many pointing out the obvious flaws in the FAA's weather theory. Meteorologists were contacted for comment. Several pointed out that hole punch clouds typically occur in cirrocumulus or altocumulus cloud layers, not the stratus layer reported at O'Hare that day. Others noted that hole punch clouds form gradually over several minutes or longer. They do not appear instantaneously when an object shoots upward through the cloud deck. The credibility of the witnesses became a central issue. Were these people reliable? Were they trained observers? Could they be trusted? The answer, by any objective measure, was yes. These were not random civilians looking up at the sky. These were aviation professionals, pilots with thousands of flight hours, mechanics who had spent careers working on aircraft, air traffic controllers who spent their days identifying and tracking objects in the sky. If anyone could be trusted to accurately describe what they had seen, it was these individuals. But the FAA held to its explanation. Weather phenomena, case closed. No further investigation was warranted. The object that a dozen people had seen hovering silently above one of the busiest airports in the world was officially nothing more than an unusual cloud formation. The witnesses were outraged. Some spoke to the media again, this time more forcefully. They knew what they had seen. It was not a cloud. It was not a weather balloon. It was not a drone. It was something solid and metallic and completely outside their frame of reference. Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who had first spotted the object, gave an interview to a local television station. His frustration was evident. "I know what I saw," he said. "We all know what we saw. And it was not weather. It was a craft, something that flew, something that should not have been there." But by then, the media had moved on. The story had run its 24-hour cycle. There were other headlines, other crises, other distractions. The O'Hare incident faded from the front page, then from the news entirely, and the witnesses were left with their memories and their unanswered questions. Act 3. The cover up begins. The official silence surrounding the O'Hare incident might have been the end of the story, except for one thing. Someone filed a Freedom of Information Act request. FOA requests are the bureaucratic equivalent of shining a flashlight into dark corners. They force government agencies to release documents and records that would otherwise remain hidden. In the case of the O'Hare incident, the FOA request demanded all records related to the November 7th sighting, including radar data, tower recordings, and any internal communications about the event. The FAA fought the request. They claimed there were no relevant records. They claimed that no official incident had occurred. They claimed that releasing any information would compromise security protocols. But under FOA law, these objections carried limited weight. Eventually, after months of legal wrangling, the FAA was forced to release a limited set of documents. What those documents revealed was startling. First, there were the tower recordings. Multiple FAA personnel could be heard discussing the incident as it was happening. Controllers mentioned that United Airlines employees were reporting an object over Gate C-17. There was confusion about what it was. There was discussion about whether to alert other aircraft in the area. And there was clear evidence that the incident had been taken seriously in real time, even if the official position later claimed otherwise. One particularly revealing exchange went like this. A controller asked if anyone had visual confirmation. Another voice responded that multiple ground personnel had confirmed seeing something. The third voice asked if it was on radar. The response was negative, no radar contact, which raised an obvious question that no one on the recording seemed willing to address out loud. How can something solid enough to be seen by a dozen people be invisible to radar? The tone of the controllers was professional, but clearly concerned. These were people who dealt with air traffic every day, who were trained to handle emergencies, who understood the systems they were working with, and they were encountering something that did not fit into any of their protocols or procedures. You could hear the uncertainty in their voices, the pauses before responses, the careful choice of words. They knew they were dealing with something unusual, and they were unsure how to proceed. Second, there were internal memos. These documents showed that United Airlines management had taken the incident seriously enough to conduct an internal investigation. They had interviewed witnesses. They had reviewed security footage, though curiously, no footage of the actual object was ever released or acknowledged to exist, and they had communicated with the FAA about the incident, despite the FAA's initial claims that they had no record of it. The existence of these memos contradicted both United Airlines and the FAA's initial denials. If the incident had not happened, why had United conducted an investigation? If the FAA had no record of it, why had United been communicating with them about it? The paper trail, incomplete as it was, made it clear that both organisations had known about the incident from the beginning and had chosen to deny it publicly. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was evidence that NORAD had been briefly involved. The North American Aerospace Defense Command is responsible for monitoring airspace and responding to potential threats. According to the released documents, someone at O'Hare had contacted NORAD about the object. Intercept protocols had been briefly initiated, and then, without explanation, the alert had been cancelled. This detail raised more questions than it answered. Why would NORAD scramble intercept protocols for a weather phenomenon? Why would they cancel those protocols before any aircraft were actually launched? And why was there no follow-up investigation by military authorities? The released documents were heavily redacted. Large sections were blacked out. Entire pages were withheld on grounds of national security or operational security. But even with these limitations, the documents made one thing abundantly clear. The O'Hare incident had been real. It had been witnessed by credible people. It had been taken seriously by multiple agencies, and then it had been deliberately buried. Investigative journalists attempted to follow up. They contacted NORAD directly. NORAD declined to comment, citing classified protocols. They contacted the Air Force. The Air Force said it had no record of any involvement. They contacted Homeland Security. Homeland Security referred them back to the FAA. The paper trail went in circles. Every agency pointed to another agency. Every official response was either a denial or a referral. And slowly, methodically, the bureaucratic machinery ground the incident down to nothing. No threat, no investigation, no explanation required. One former FAA official, speaking off the record years later, admitted what many had suspected all along. "Of course we tracked it," the official said. "Of course we knew it was there." But once it became clear that it was not a conventional aircraft, and once it became clear that it had left without causing any damage or injuries, the decision was made to classify it as a non-event. Why? Because there was no protocol for dealing with it, no framework, no procedure. It was easier to pretend it had not happened than to try to explain what it was. This unofficial admission confirmed what the witnesses had always believed. The incident had been real, the object had been real, and the cover-up had been deliberate. Act 4. The physical impossibility. In the months and years following the O'Hare incident, aviation experts and physicists began to analyse what the witnesses had described. Their conclusion was unanimous. What had been reported was physically impossible according to every known principle of aerodynamics and propulsion. Commercial pilots were interviewed. They pointed out that no known aircraft can hover motionless without visible means of propulsion. Helicopters use rotors, drones use multiple propellers, Harrier jump jets use directed thrust from their engines. All of these methods produce noise, vibration, and visible signs of their operation. The object at O'Hare had none of these characteristics. Moreover, no known aircraft can accelerate from 0 to supersonic speeds instantaneously. Acceleration requires time, it requires thrust. It requires a visible transition from stationary to motion. The object at O'Hare had exhibited none of this. It had been motionless, and then it had been gone. The witnesses described it as if someone had simply switched it from one state to another, with no intermediary phase. The physics of such an acceleration are staggering to contemplate. If an object 30 feet in diameter and presumably massing several tons were to accelerate from 0 to even subsonic speed instantaneously, the forces involved would be catastrophic. The object itself would need to be constructed from materials that could withstand thousands of times the force of gravity. Any conventional materials, steel, aluminum, titanium, would be torn apart by such forces. And yet the witnesses reported no sound of tearing metal, no explosions, no debris falling from the sky. The object had simply gone from stationary to gone in less time than it takes to blink. The hole in the clouds presented its own set of problems. Meteorologists explained that clouds are not solid. They are composed of tiny water droplets or ice crystals suspended in air. When an object passes through a cloud, the cloud does not tear. It does not leave a clean hole with defined edges. It might create temporary wake or disturbance, but that disturbance dissipates almost immediately. The hole described by the O'Hare witnesses had stayed visible for several minutes, with crisp geometric edges that suggested something far more violent than simple passage through water vapour. One aeronautical engineer, speaking anonymously to a science publication, offered a theory. If an object were to accelerate upward with sufficient speed and force, he said, it could potentially create a shockwave that would temporarily displace the cloud layer. But the energy required to do this would be enormous. We are talking about something that would generate sonic booms, visible contrails, tremendous heat. The witnesses reported none of these things, so whatever caused that hole, it was not conventional propulsion. Boeing engineers were contacted for comment. Most declined. A few, speaking off the record, admitted that they had no explanation for what had been described. One engineer put it bluntly, "If someone showed me the specs for an aircraft that could do what those witnesses described, I would tell them it was science fiction. You cannot violate the laws of physics. just because you want to. And what they saw violated just about every law we understand. The radar invisibility was another puzzle. Modern radar systems can detect birds, they can detect weather formations, they can detect small drones at significant distances. The idea that a 30-foot metallic disc could hover over a major airport and leave no radar signature made no sense. Unless, some speculated, the object was made of materials or used technology that could somehow absorb or deflect radar waves. But even this explanation raised more questions than it answered. Such technology, if it existed, would represent a breakthrough so significant that it would revolutionize military aviation. Why would it be flying over a civilian airport in broad daylight? Thomas Wilkins, the mechanic who first spotted the object, gave one final interview several years after the incident. By then, he had retired from United Airlines. He no longer had anything to lose by speaking publicly. His words were measured and careful, but his conviction was absolute. "I have worked on aircraft for 30 years, he said. I know what planes look like. I know what helicopters look like. I know what drones look like. What I saw that day was none of those things. It was something else, something I cannot explain. And I think that is what scares people. Not that we saw something strange, but that we saw something we cannot explain. And if we cannot explain it, then we do not understand the world as well as we thought we did." Another witness, a pilot who had seen the object from his cockpit, was even more direct. "If it were a drone," he said, "we would be flying them by now. If it were some kind of experimental military craft, someone would have come forward. This was not human technology. I do not know what it was, but I know what it was not, and it was not ours. The physics of the incident remained stubbornly unsolvable. Every attempt to explain it using conventional science fell short. Every theory required assumptions that could not be supported by evidence, and so the incident remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, an anomaly, an impossibility, a hole not just in the clouds, but in our understanding of what was possible." Epilogue. The incident that disappeared. More than 15 years have passed since the O'Hare incident. The witnesses have scattered. Some still work in aviation. Others have retired. A few have passed away. But not one of them has recanted their testimony. Not one has admitted to being mistaken or confused. Not one has changed their story. This consistency is remarkable in itself. Human memory is fallible. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable over time. Details blur, stories change, people misremember. But the O'Hare witnesses have remained consistent for over 15 years. They all describe the same object, the same behaviour, the same departure, the same hole in the clouds. Their accounts have not drifted or evolved. They have not embellished or exaggerated. They have simply reported year after year what they saw that November afternoon. The official record remains unchanged. The FAA still classifies the incident as weather phenomena. No formal investigation was ever conducted. No radar data was ever released. No explanation was ever provided that satisfactorily addressed the facts as reported by the witnesses. Gate C-17 still operates at O'Hare. Planes still taxi past it every day. Passengers still board flights there, completely unaware that they are standing at the site of one of the most credible UFO sightings in modern history. The airport itself has moved on. The airlines have moved on. The world has moved on. But the questions remain. What was the object that hovered over O'Hare on November 7th, 2006? Where did it come from? Where did it go? Who built it? And perhaps most importantly, why has there been such determined resistance to investigating it seriously? Some argue that the resistance stems from simple bureaucratic inertia. Agencies do not like to investigate things they cannot explain. It creates paperwork. It creates liability. It creates uncomfortable questions from the public and the press. Far easier to dismiss the whole thing and move on. But others point to something deeper. The O'Hare incident represents a challenge to our understanding of reality itself. If we acknowledge that the witnesses saw what they claimed to see, then we must also acknowledge that there are technologies operating in our airspace that we do not understand. Technologies that violate our understanding of physics. technologies that, by definition, are beyond our current scientific framework. For institutions that pride themselves on control and understanding, this is an intolerable conclusion. Others suggest more sinister explanations. They point to the NORAD involvement. They point to the redacted documents. They point to the quick shutdown of any serious investigation. They argue that the government knows more than it is admitting, that the incident was classified, that the truth is being deliberately withheld. The truth, as always, may be more mundane. Perhaps there was no grand conspiracy. Perhaps there was simply an institutional unwillingness to confront something that did not fit into established categories. Perhaps the cover-up, if it can be called that, was not a deliberate act of secrecy, but rather a reflexive defensive action by organisations that were genuinely unsure how to proceed. The witnesses themselves have varying opinions. Some believe the object was extraterrestrial in origin. Others think it was some kind of classified military technology being tested without proper authorization. A few believe it was something else entirely, something that does not fit into any convenient category. But they all agree on one fundamental point. What they saw was real. It was not a hallucination. It was not a hoax. It was not weather. It was a physical object that defied explanation. And the fact that it has been so thoroughly dismissed, so completely erased from official acknowledgement, troubles them deeply. The broader implications of the O'Hare incident extend beyond the specific events of that November afternoon. It raises questions about how our society handles anomalous events, how we respond when trained professionals report something that contradicts our understanding of what is possible, whether we have systems in place to investigate such events seriously and transparently, and whether we are willing to acknowledge uncertainty rather than retreating into comfortable denials. In an age of increasing surveillance, when cameras are everywhere and data is constantly being recorded, the O'Hare incident stands as a reminder that some things still slip through the gaps, that there are still moments when something extraordinary can occur in full view of multiple witnesses and yet leave behind almost no physical evidence. No photographs that clearly show the object, no video footage that has been released publicly, no radar data that confirms what the witnesses saw, just human testimony. Just people willing to put their credibility on the line to say what they experienced. Janet Thornton, the gate supervisor who witnessed the incident, summed it up in an interview years later. "We are trained to be reliable," she said. "We are trained to be precise. Our jobs depend on our ability to observe accurately and report honestly. And then we report something that does not fit the official narrative, and suddenly we are dismissed as unreliable witnesses. That is what hurts the most. Not that people do not believe what we saw, but that they question our credibility and professionalism because we had the courage to report it." The O'Hare incident remains one of the most well-documented UFO sightings in history. It occurred in broad daylight. It was witnessed by multiple trained professionals. It happened at a major public facility with extensive security and monitoring systems. And yet, officially, it does not exist. It is a non-event, a footnote, a curiosity. But for those who were there, who saw the metallic disc hovering silently above Gate C-17, who watched it shoot straight up through the clouds at impossible speed, who stood there looking at the perfect circular hole it left behind, the incident is anything but a curiosity. It is proof that there are things in our skies that we do not understand. Proof that our technology, advanced as it may be, is not the most advanced technology. Proof that we are not alone in believing that the universe holds mysteries we have yet to solve. Thomas Wilkins, now in his 70s, still lives in the Chicago area. He rarely talks about the incident anymore. He has told his story so many times that it has become exhausting. But when pressed, when asked if he still believes what he saw was real, his answer is immediate and unwavering. "I know what I saw," he says. "We all know what we saw, and no amount of official denial will change that. It was there. It was real. It was a craft. That word, craft. It appears again and again in the witness statements. Not object, not phenomenon. Craft. A word that implies intention, design, purpose, control. A word that suggests something built by someone, somewhere, for some reason. And so the O'Hare incident remains, not solved, not explained, not officially acknowledged, but remembered, by the witnesses who will carry it with them for the rest of their lives, by the researchers who continue to study it, by the public who finds in it a glimmer of something extraordinary in an increasingly mundane world. On November 7th, 2006, something impossible happened over Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Something that challenged our understanding of physics, aerodynamics, and technology. Something that was witnessed by credible, trained professionals and then systematically erased from official acknowledgement. The hole in the clouds has long since closed, but the hole in our understanding remains, and perhaps that is the real legacy of the O'Hare incident. Not what we saw, but what we still do not know, and what we may never know, unless someday someone decides to tell the truth. The end. The Socorro encounter. The day the desert burned. April 24th, 1964. Socorro, New Mexico. 5:45 p.m. What Lonnie Zamora saw that Friday evening would shatter everything the United States government thought it knew about what flies through our skies. Within hours, the FBI would seal off a stretch of desert. Within days, NASA would send personnel who officially weren't there. Within weeks, Air Force investigators would stamp a case file with a classification they almost never used. Unexplained. This is not a story about belief. This is a story about evidence that still exists. About burns in the earth that were photographed, measured and archived. About a man who lost everything for refusing to lie about what he witnessed. This is the Socorro encounter, and 60 years later, no one has been able to explain it away. Part 1. The Pursuit. The desert heat shimmered over Highway 85 as Lonnie Zamora accelerated his Socorro Police Department cruiser, black and white paint job already coated in the fine dust that covered everything in this part of New Mexico. At 31 years old, Zamora had been a patrolman for 7 years, known throughout the small town as reliable, level-headed, and completely uninterested in nonsense. He went to Mass every Sunday, coached Little League on Saturdays, and had never called in sick to work. The kind of man whose word meant something. His target was a black Chevrolet sedan, doing at least 60 in a 45 zone, weaving slightly between lanes as it headed south out of town. Zamora had his lights flashing, siren cutting through the dry air, closing the distance between them. It was routine. He'd done this 1,000 times. Then came the sound. It started as a low rumble that Zamora felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. Then it grew, impossibly fast, into a roaring explosion that seemed to split the sky open. The sound was so massive, so violent, that his first thought was dynamite. Maybe a mining accident at one of the old operations in the hills. Maybe something worse. The speeding Chevrolet was forgotten instantly. Zamora yanked the wheel right, tires spitting gravel as he turned off the highway onto the rough dirt road that led toward the source of the sound. His training kicked in automatically. Radio dispatch, report possible explosion, request backup if needed. But when he reached for the handset, he hesitated, because now he could see something, about a half-mile ahead. Over the rise of a rocky hill dotted with mesquite and creosote bushes, there was a blue-orange flame in the sky. Not like a fire, not like a flare. It was intense, focused, like the flame of a massive welding torch pointing straight down at the earth. And it was completely silent now. The roaring had stopped the instant he'd turned onto this road. Zamora's cruiser struggled up the steep gravel incline, engine whining in first gear, suspension bouncing over rocks and ruts. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough that his knuckles went white. The flame was descending, dropping below his line of sight behind the ridgeline. Dust rose in a cloud where it seemed to be touching down. When he crested the hill, Zamora slammed on the brakes so hard the cruiser fishtailed, rear end sliding in the loose dirt before jerking to a stop. About 200 yards away, in a shallow arroyo surrounded by scrub brush, sat something that didn't belong in the desert or anywhere else on Earth. Part 2. The Object. Zamora sat frozen behind the wheel, his mind trying desperately to make sense of what his eyes were showing him. The object was white, smooth, and egg-shaped, roughly the size of a sedan but much taller, standing vertically on 4 thin metallic legs that splayed outward like a lunar module's landing struts. The surface was seamless, no rivets, no panels, no windows, just smooth white metal that reflected the late afternoon sun with a dull, almost ceramic sheen. But that wasn't what made Zamora's hands start to shake. Beside the craft, moving with quick, purposeful motions, were 2 figures. They were small, maybe 4.5 feet tall, possibly 5 at most. They wore white coveralls or suits that seemed to be all one piece, with no visible seams or zippers. From this distance, Zamora couldn't make out faces clearly, but the proportions were wrong. The heads seemed slightly too large. The movements were fluid but oddly mechanical, like watching someone perform a task they'd done 10,000 times before. One of the figures was crouched near the base of the object, apparently working on something. The other stood upright, holding what might have been a tool or instrument. Then they both turned their heads and looked directly at him. Zamora felt his stomach drop. There was something about that moment, that instant of eye contact across 200 yards of desert, that bypassed his rational mind entirely and spoke to something much older. The primal part of the brain that knows, without needing to understand when you're in the presence of something fundamentally other. The figures moved fast. One instant they were beside the craft. The next they'd vanished around the far side, hidden from view by the object's bulk. Zamora heard no voices, no sounds of running feet, nothing but the soft whistle of wind through the scrub brush. He had to report this, had to call it in. But what words could possibly describe what he was seeing? His hand found the radio handset, lifted it. His thumb pressed the transmit button. His voice, when it came out, sounded strange even to his own ears. Higher-pitched, shaking. Socorro, this is Unit 2. I've got something here. West of the old dynamite shack, there's a vehicle of some kind, and... He paused, swallowed hard. And occupants. 2 occupants. Not from around here. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, confused. Say again, Unit 2. Did you say occupants? But Zamora didn't answer, because the object was beginning to make noise again. Part 3. Ascent. The sound started as a high-pitched whine, like a jet engine spooling up, but cleaner somehow, more focused. The blue-orange flame appeared again beneath the craft, but now Zamora could see it clearly. It wasn't fire, not really. It was more like concentrated light, intense and directional, with none of the smoke or heat distortion you'd expect from combustion. The landing struts lifted free of the ground. Dust exploded outward in a perfect circle as the object rose, slowly at first, wobbling slightly like a helicopter finding its balance. But there were no rotors, no visible means of propulsion except that impossible flame. Zamora yanked open the cruiser door and stumbled out, unable to look away. The object cleared the arroyo rim, still rising, and he suddenly realized with cold certainty that if it tipped in his direction, if that flame swept across him, he would be incinerated in seconds. He ran, not back to the cruiser. Some instinct told him to get distance, get separation. He sprinted toward a small outcropping of the rock 20 yards away, diving behind it and pressing himself flat against the ground, hands covering his head. His service revolver pressed painfully into his ribs where it was holstered against his side, and the absurd thought crossed his mind that if he needed to shoot at that thing, a .38 caliber bullet wouldn't even scratch its surface. The whining sound intensified, then suddenly cut out. Zamora lifted his head, peering over the rock. The object was hovering, just hanging in the air about 20 feet off the ground, completely motionless despite the gusting wind. The flame had vanished. There was no sound at all now, no roar of engines, no whine of turbines. Nothing. It began to move, not like any aircraft Zamora had ever seen. There was no acceleration curve, no gradual build-up of speed. One moment it was hovering. The next it was moving horizontally across the desert, smooth and fast like a stone skipping across water. It cleared the ridgeline to the southwest, dropped low again, following the contours of the land. Then it simply accelerated away, not straight up into the sky like a rocket, not in a steep climb like a jet. It moved parallel to the ground, hugging the terrain for maybe 2 seconds, and then it was just gone, vanishing into the distance so fast that Zamora's eyes couldn't track it. One instant it was there, a white egg shape against the desert. The next instant there was only empty sky. Total time from landing to disappearance. Less than 2 minutes. Zamora stayed behind the rock for another 30 seconds, breathing hard, his entire body shaking with adrenaline. When he finally stood up and walked back toward his cruiser on unsteady legs, he could see smoke rising from the arroyo where the object had burned. Something was burning. Part 4. The Evidence. By the time Sergeant Sam Chavez arrived, responding to Zamora's increasingly frantic radio calls, smoke was still rising from 4 distinct points in the arroyo. Chavez knew Zamora well. They'd worked together for 3 years. Zamora was the last person on the force who'd make something like this up. If Lonnie said he saw something, he saw something. But this was insane. "Show me," Chavez said simply. They walked down into the arroyo together, and what they found would become the cornerstone of one of the most investigated UFO cases in history. 4 distinct burn marks, circular, each about 8 inches across, scorched deep into the hard desert soil. They were arranged in an irregular quadrilateral pattern, roughly 12 to 15 feet apart, exactly where landing struts would have pressed into the earth if something heavy had set down. The burns were still hot. Chavez knelt beside one, holding his hand 6 inches above the scorched earth, and pulled back from the radiating heat. The surrounding vegetation, greasewood and mesquite bushes, were charred and smoking but not consumed by flame. It was as if something had subjected them to intense heat for just seconds, long enough to burn but not to catch fire and spread. "Don't touch anything," Chavez said, straightening up. "This is way above our pay grade." He was right. Within 20 minutes the site was crawling with personnel. First the local fire department, then the state police, then the county sheriff. Someone made a call to Stallion Range Center at White Sands Missile Range. Someone else called Kirtland Air Force Base. By nightfall, men in suits were taking photographs, collecting soil samples, measuring radiation levels with Geiger counters that clicked steadily, showing readings notably higher than background levels. And while all this was happening, other witnesses started coming forward. Part 5. Convergence. Paul Keyes owned a gas station on the north end of Socorro. At approximately 5:50 p.m., 5 minutes after Zamora's encounter, he'd been standing outside his shop when he saw something in the sky to the southwest. Egg-shaped, white, moving fast and low over the desert. He'd assumed it was some kind of military aircraft from White Sands. But when he heard about Zamora's encounter later that evening, his stomach dropped. He hadn't seen an aircraft. He'd seen the same thing Zamora had described. Bessie McKinney and her husband had been driving on Highway 60, about 8 miles south of Socorro, when they'd seen an unusual light in the sky. Bright blue-orange, like a flare but much larger, moving north to south at incredible speed. They'd noted the time, 5:48 p.m. The timeline matched perfectly. But perhaps the most compelling corroboration came from Larry Kratzer, a tourist from Iowa who'd been photographing the landscape from a scenic pullout on Highway 85. He'd heard the initial explosion, loud enough that he'd looked up from his camera in alarm. Then he'd seen something in the sky, silvery white, moving away from Socorro at what he estimated was several hundred miles per hour. He'd dismissed it as military. This was New Mexico, after all. Home to White Sands, Los Alamos, Sandia Labs. Experimental aircraft flew here all the time, except when the FBI called him 3 days later and asked him very specifically not to discuss what he'd seen, he started to wonder if maybe it hadn't been military after all. Or if it had been, it wasn't one of ours. Part 6. Project Blue Book. Captain Richard Holder arrived from Kirtland Air Force Base before midnight. With him came 2 specialists from Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program that had been quietly operating since 1952. Their job was to explain away UFO sightings, to find rational explanations that would satisfy the public and allow the Air Force to maintain the official position that UFOs pose no threat to national security. This case, Holder realised within the hour of arriving at the site, was going to be a problem. The landing pad impressions were real, physical, documented by multiple law enforcement agencies. The burned vegetation was real, the elevated radiation readings were real, and Lonnie Zamora was about as credible a witness as you could ask for. Veteran cop. No history of mental illness, no financial motive, no interest in UFOs or science fiction. The man read westerns and watched baseball. He was as straight-arrow American as they came. Captain Holder spent 6 hours interviewing Zamora that night, going over every detail, trying to find inconsistencies or exaggerations. There were none. Zamora's story remained exactly the same, told in the same flat, factual tone, with the same details in the same order. What troubled Holder most wasn't what Zamora said. It was what he wouldn't say. When asked to describe the beings he'd seen in more detail, Zamora became uncomfortable. They were small, he said, wearing white suits, moving around the craft. But their faces, Holder pressed. Did you see their faces? Zamora was quiet for a long moment. I saw them, he finally said. That's all I'm going to say about that. Years later, FBI documents declassified through FOIA requests would reveal that Zamora had described the beings in much more detail in a private interview, but had been specifically instructed by federal agents not to discuss certain aspects of their appearance publicly. What he'd told them remained redacted in the official files. Part 7. The investigation deepens. Major Hector Quintanilla, the head of Project Blue Book, arrived at Socorro 3 days after the incident. With him came specialists in metallurgy, soil analysis, propulsion systems and radiation detection. This was no longer a routine investigation. This was something the Air Force needed to understand, contain, and if possible, explain away. But the physical evidence kept refusing to cooperate. Soil samples from the landing site showed unusual magnetic properties. The burned vegetation contained trace amounts of elements that shouldn't have been present, metallic compounds that one analyst described as inconsistent with any conventional fuel source. The heat required to create the burns, based on the depth of scorching in the roots of the greasewood bushes, was estimated at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, applied for approximately 3 to 5 seconds. No conventional aircraft engine produced that kind of concentrated directional heat. Quintanilla interviewed Zamora personally, along with every other witness. He visited the site repeatedly, at different times of day, trying to understand sight lines and distances. He contacted every military installation within 200 miles, asking if any experimental craft had been operating in the area on April 24th. Every single base said no. White Sands had no tests scheduled. Holloman Air Force Base had nothing in the air. Los Alamos had no experiments running. Even the classified programs, the ones that officially didn't exist, were checked and cleared. Whatever Lonnie Zamora had seen, it wasn't one of theirs. Quintanilla spent 2 weeks in Socorro. When he finally left, returning to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, he carried with him boxes of evidence, hundreds of photographs, dozens of interviews, and exactly 0 answers. On June 15, 1964, Project Blue Book officially closed the Socorro case with the classification unknown. It was only the second time in the programme's 12-year history that they'd used that designation. Part 8. The Skeptics Arrive. Dr. Donald Menzel was a Harvard astronomer who'd made a second career out of debunking UFO reports. When he heard about Socorro, he immediately proposed his theory. Zamora had seen a secret military test vehicle, possibly a lunar lander prototype being tested by NASA. The theory fell apart within days. NASA produced complete logs of every test vehicle location on April 24th. None were within 500 miles of New Mexico. The lunar lander program was still 18 months from its first tethered hover test. And besides, the lunar module used hypergolic fuels that produced thick orange smoke. Zamora had reported no smoke at all. Next came the experimental aircraft theory. Perhaps it was a VTOL prototype, a vertical takeoff and landing plane being tested in secret. But aviation experts quickly pointed out the flaws. No VTOL aircraft in 1964 could hover silently. No engine technology existed that could produce the kind of rapid acceleration Zamora described. The craft had gone from hover to gone in under 3 seconds, with no sound barrier boom, despite clearly exceeding the speed of sound. The balloon theory was proposed and abandoned within hours. Balloons don't leave landing gear impressions. They don't burn vegetation. They don't move against the wind at hundreds of miles per hour. The hoax theory lasted longer, but ultimately crumbled under scrutiny. For Zamora to have faked this, he would have needed to create 4 precisely placed burn marks deep enough to fool federal investigators, coordinate with at least 4 other witnesses, none of whom knew each other, somehow elevate radiation levels at the site, risk his career and reputation for no financial gain whatsoever, and do all of this within minutes before backup arrived. It was absurd. Shutdowns. Part 9. The Silent Visitors. What wasn't made public at the time, what wouldn't be revealed until decades later through declassified documents and deathbed testimonies, was that other agencies had become very interested in Socorro. CIA personnel visited the site disguised as Air Force investigators. They took their own samples, conducted their own interviews, and filed their own reports that went into files the public would never see. NASA sent 2 engineers from the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Officially, they weren't there. Their travel vouchers were later discovered to have been deliberately mislabeled, showing a completely different destination. They spent 3 days examining the landing site, paying particular attention to the propulsion evidence, the nature of the burns, the pattern of the landing gear. One of those engineers, speaking privately to a colleague years after retirement, admitted that what he'd seen at Socorro had fundamentally changed his understanding of what was possible. The thermodynamics didn't make sense, he said. The energy required to do what that thing did, with no visible fuel source, no exhaust signature, no sonic boom at supersonic speeds. We're talking about physics we don't understand. And then there was J. Allen Hynek. Part 10. The Skeptic Converts. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was an astronomer from Northwestern University who'd been hired by the Air Force in 1952 as a scientific consultant to Project Blue Book. His job, explicitly, was to debunk UFO reports, to find natural explanations that would satisfy the public and allow the Air Force to maintain that there was nothing to worry about. For 12 years, Hynek had done exactly that. Swamp gas, weather balloons, Venus, temperature inversions. He'd explained away hundreds of sightings with scientific rigour and just enough condescension to make the witnesses feel foolish for even reporting what they'd seen. Socorro broke him. Hynek arrived expecting another easy explanation. He left 3 days later, shaken and disturbed. In his private notes, never meant for public release, he wrote, "This is the case that keeps me up at night. I can find no conventional explanation. The witness is beyond reproach. The physical evidence is undeniable. The corroborating witnesses are credible. If I were to say this is real, that Zamora truly encountered something not of this world, I would be laughed out of the scientific community. But if I dismiss it, I am lying to myself about what the evidence clearly shows. In public, Hynek towed the Air Force line. He suggested weather phenomena, ball lightning, perhaps an unusual mirage combined with military activity. But he never quite committed to any explanation. His official report concluded that the case was genuinely puzzling and not easily explained by conventional means. Years later, after Project Blue Book was shut down in 1970, Hynek would become the most prominent scientist to publicly acknowledge that some UFO cases represented genuine mysteries that deserved serious scientific study. He founded the Center for UFO Studies, wrote books, consulted on films. He spent the last 2 decades of his life trying to undo the damage he felt he'd done by dismissing so many reports too quickly. But Socorro, he always said, was the one that changed everything. "I've investigated over 1,000 UFO reports," he told a television interviewer in 1977. "Only a handful truly frightened me. Socorro was one of them, because there was no way to explain it away, and that meant accepting something I'd spent my entire career denying could be possible." Part 11. The pressure mounts. For Lonnie Zamora, the aftermath of April 24th was worse than the encounter itself. The press descended on Socorro like locusts. Reporters from newspapers, magazines, television stations, all wanting to interview the cop who'd seen a flying saucer and little green men. Zamora hated every second of it. He refused most interviews. When he did speak, he stuck to just the facts, emotionless and brief, desperate to make it all go away. But it wouldn't go away. The FBI visited him repeatedly, sometimes weekly, asking the same questions over and over, trying to find inconsistencies. Did the beings really look humanoid? Exactly how tall were they? What made him think they weren't just technicians from White Sands wearing protective suits? "Because I know what people look like," Zamora finally snapped during one particularly aggressive interview. "These weren't people. I don't know what they were, but they weren't people." The agent writing his report paused, looked up. "Officer Zamora, it would be much simpler for everyone if you could say they appeared to be human. Just unusual proportions, perhaps. Children, maybe. Or small adults." Zamora stood up. The interview was over, but the pressure continued. His fellow officers started looking at him strangely. Some believed him completely. Others thought he'd cracked under stress, that he'd seen something mundane and his mind had twisted it into something impossible. A few suggested he take some time off, get his head straight. The tourists were even worse. Socorro became a destination for UFO enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, people who wanted to see the landing site, shake Zamora's hand, hear the story firsthand. The police station started getting calls from people claiming to channel messages from the aliens, or saying they'd been contacted too, or offering to help Zamora understand what had really happened. His wife, Patricia, bore the brunt of it at home, threatening letters from religious fundamentalists who believed he'd seen demons, marriage proposals from women who found the idea of a man contacted by aliens romantic, anonymous calls in the middle of the night, sometimes silent, sometimes screaming accusations of fraud. By 1965, barely a year after the encounter, Lonnie Zamora was done. He submitted his resignation to the Socorro Police Department, effective immediately. He and Patricia moved to a small property outside of town, away from the main roads, and Zamora made it clear to everyone who knew him that the subject was closed. He would not discuss what he'd seen. He would not give interviews. He would not participate in UFO conferences or investigations. He just wanted to be left alone. Part 12. The Alternate Theories. In the absence of an official explanation, dozens of alternative theories emerged over the following decades. Each one tried to explain away what Zamora had seen, and each one ultimately failed. The college prank theory gained traction in the 1980s, when a man named Lyle Boyd claimed that he and several engineering students from New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology had hoaxed the entire event using a hot air balloon, flares, and cardboard. The story fell apart under minimal scrutiny. The engineering department at the school had no record of any student project matching Boyd's description. The timeline didn't work, and Boyd himself admitted under questioning that he'd never actually been to the landing site before making his claims. The earthquake theory proposed that Zamora had witnessed earthquake lights, a rare atmospheric phenomenon associated with seismic activity, combined with a meteorological temperature inversion that created a mirage. But seismological records showed no earthquake activity in New Mexico on April 24th, and earthquake lights don't leave landing gear impressions or burns vegetation. The drone theory was popular in the 2000s, suggesting Zamora had seen an early unmanned aerial vehicle being tested by the military. But drone technology in 1964 was limited to slow, cumbersome radio-controlled aircraft with nowhere near the performance characteristics Zamora described. No drone could hover silently, accelerate to supersonic speeds, or carry enough fuel to produce the heat signatures found at the landing site. Each theory tried so hard to avoid the simplest explanation that fit all the facts, that on April 24, 1964, something not made by human hands touched down in the New Mexico desert, was witnessed by a credible observer, left physical evidence, and then departed in a manner that defied known physics. Part 13. The cover-up that wasn't for conspiracy theorists. Socorro represented the ultimate cover-up. The government knew exactly what Zamora had seen, they claimed, but was hiding the truth to prevent mass panic. Secret files existed somewhere, locked away in Pentagon vaults or underground bunkers, containing the real story. But the reality was somehow more disturbing than any cover-up. The government didn't know what happened at Socorro. They'd investigated with every resource at their disposal, used every analytical tool available in 1964, consulted every expert they could find, and they'd come up with nothing. The case was classified as unknown, not because they were hiding the truth, but because they genuinely didn't have one. This terrified the military establishment far more than any alien encounter would have. If it was aliens, that was at least something you could prepare for, plan around, develop contingencies against. But if it was something else, something that defied categorization entirely, then how could you defend against it? How could you even begin to understand it? The Project Blue Book files on Socorro, when they were finally declassified in the 1970s, revealed the depth of the government's confusion. Memo after memo showed officials grasping at explanations, discarding them, grasping at new ones. The final report, written by Major Quintanilla, was remarkably honest in its assessment. This case remains unexplained. All conventional explanations have been examined and found wanting. The witness is credible, the physical evidence is real, and no known aircraft or natural phenomenon can account for the observations. That honesty, that admission of genuine ignorance, was buried in a filing cabinet for 15 years. Not because of a vast conspiracy, but because it was embarrassing. The United States Air Force, the most technologically advanced military force in human history, couldn't explain what one police officer saw in a New Mexico arroyo. Part 14. The Scientific Legacy. What the Air Force couldn't explain, civilian scientists tried to understand. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the physical evidence from Socorro was quietly studied by researchers at various universities and private laboratories. The soil samples, the vegetation samples, the radiation readings, all were analysed using increasingly sophisticated techniques. The results were always the same: anomalous, unusual, inconsistent with known technology. One study from Stanford's physics department in 1979 analysed the pattern of magnetic disturbance in the soil samples. The magnetisation was precisely aligned, as if a powerful, focused magnetic field had been applied for several seconds. But the field strength required would have been enormous, far beyond anything that could be generated by portable equipment in 1964. Another study focused on the metallic traces found in the burned vegetation. Mass spectrometry revealed titanium, aluminum, and several rare earth elements in ratios that didn't match any known alloy or fuel. One researcher noted that the combination was actually similar to what would later be used in advanced aerospace applications, but in 1964 such materials were still largely experimental. The heat signature remained the most puzzling aspect. To burn vegetation root systems to the depth observed at Socorro required focused heat of extraordinary intensity applied for only seconds. The closest analogy researchers could find was laser technology, but in 1964, lasers were massive laboratory instruments, not something that could be mounted on a flying craft. Dr. James McDonald, a physicist from the University of Arizona who dedicated the later part of his career to serious UFO research, visited the Socorro site multiple times in the late 1960s. He conducted his own soil analysis, interviewed Zamora personally, and reviewed all the available evidence. His conclusion, published in a paper for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics in 1968, was carefully worded but clear. The Socorro incident represents physical evidence of a craft using propulsion technology unknown to our current understanding of physics. That paper cost MacDonald his reputation in mainstream science. He was ridiculed, his funding dried up, and he died by suicide in 1971. His colleagues later suggested the professional isolation he faced after going public with his UFO research had contributed to his depression. Part 15. The Witness in Winter. Lonnie Zamora lived another 45 years after his encounter. He died in 2009 at the age of 76, having kept his silence for most of those decades. In his final years, he granted only a handful of interviews, always reluctantly, always with the same message. I know what I saw, I reported it honestly. What anyone else believes is up to them. The few people who remained close to Zamora in his later years said the encounter had changed him, in ways that went beyond the public attention and harassment. He became more withdrawn, more contemplative. He spent hours staring at the night sky from his back porch, rarely speaking about what he was thinking. His wife Patricia died in 1998, and after that Zamora became even more isolated. His children, now adults with families of their own, tried to stay involved in his life, but he pushed them away gently but firmly. He sold his property outside Socorro and moved to a small trailer home on the edge of town, where he could see the arroyo where the encounter had happened. In 2006, 3 years before his death, a researcher from the National Institute for Discovery Science managed to secure a brief interview with Zamora. The conversation was never published, but the researcher's notes survived. In them, Zamora made a statement he'd never made publicly before. People ask me if I'm afraid of them coming back, the little ones I saw, but fear isn't the right word. What I felt that day, what I still feel when I think about it, it's like standing at the edge of the ocean for the first time and realizing how vast it is, how much we don't know, how small we are. Fear is too simple. It's more like awe and loneliness, because I saw something that proved we're not alone, but I've spent the last 42 years being alone with that knowledge. When Zamora died of heart failure in November 2009, his obituary in the Socorro Chieftain mentioned the encounter in passing, buried in the middle paragraph. To his family, to his friends, to the people who'd known him for decades, he wasn't the UFO cop. He was Lonnie, the good man who'd seen something extraordinary and lived the rest of his life in the shadow of that single evening. His funeral was small, private, and his family requested no media attention. He was buried in the Socorro Mission Cemetery beneath a simple stone that read, Lonnie Zamora, 1933-2009, devoted husband, father and friend. No mention of April 24th, 1964. Tessasist. Part 16. The Site Today. The arroyo where Lonnie Zamora had his encounter is still there, largely unchanged by time. It's accessible via the same dirt road Zamora drove that Friday evening, though the gravel has been graded and improved over the years, as the location became an unofficial tourist destination for UFO researchers and curious travellers. The 4 landing pad depressions are long gone, eroded by 60 years of wind, rain and foot traffic. The vegetation has grown back. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd drive past without noticing anything unusual. Just another stretch of New Mexico desert, scrub brush and rocks and big sky. But there's a small marker now, installed by the city of Socorro in 1994 on the 30th anniversary of the encounter. It's a simple plaque on a low stone monument, positioned approximately where Zamora's cruiser had been parked when he first saw the craft. The inscription reads, Socorro UFO Landing Site. On April 24, 1964, Socorro police officer Lonnie Zamora witnessed an unidentified flying object at this location. The incident was investigated by multiple federal agencies and remains unexplained. The city debated for years whether to install the marker. Some felt it turned Socorro into a joke, a punchline for skeptics who viewed the whole thing as small-town delusion. Others argued it was a significant part of their history and that Zamora deserved to be recognised for his honesty and courage in reporting what he'd seen. In the end, the marker went up. And every year on April 24th, a handful of people make the pilgrimage to the site. Some are researchers, documenting the location, taking measurements, comparing current conditions to the photographs from 1964. Some are believers, people convinced that Zamora's encounter was proof of extraterrestrial visitation. Some are skeptics, looking for evidence of hoax or misidentification. And some are just curious, drawn by the mystery of it all. The idea that in this age of surveillance and smartphones and satellites, there are still events that defy explanation. That there are still genuine mysteries in the world. Part 17. The institutional memory. Within NASA, Socorro has never been forgotten. In internal propulsion studies conducted throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the case was repeatedly referenced as an example of observed performance characteristics that exceeded known technology. Engineers studying advanced propulsion concepts, anti-gravity research, and field propulsion systems would cite Socorro as a benchmark. If such a craft existed, if it could perform the manoeuvres Zamora described, what would the physics look like? A 1978 NASA technical memorandum declassified in 2002 included a section titled Anomalous Propulsion Observations. Socorro was case study number 1. The document analysed the craft's observed capabilities: silent hover, rapid acceleration without sonic boom, no visible exhaust or fuel consumption, precise directional control. The conclusion was stark. No known propulsion system, current or projected, can replicate these performance characteristics. Either the witness observations are fundamentally flawed, or we are observing technology that operates on principles not yet understood by terrestrial science. That memo was written by engineers who'd helped put men on the moon. These weren't fringe theorists or conspiracy enthusiasts. These were people at the absolute cutting edge of aerospace technology, and they were admitting that what happened at Socorro was beyond them. The institutional interest continued into the modern era. When NASA began seriously studying breakthrough propulsion physics in the 1990s, Socorro appeared again in the research. Mark Millis, who headed the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics project from 1996 to 2002, acknowledged in a 2004 interview that historical UFO cases with credible witnesses and physical evidence were studied as part of the program. "We weren't trying to prove aliens," he said. "We were trying to identify performance characteristics that might point toward new physics. Cases like Socorro, where you have documented evidence and credible observers, those are valuable data points." The project was defunded in 2002, officially due to lack of progress toward practical applications. But the research hadn't stopped. It had just moved into classified programs that operated without public oversight or disclosure. Part 18. The Blue Book Confessions. Major Hector Quintanilla carried the weight of Socorro with him for the rest of his life. After retiring from the Air Force in 1970, he largely avoided speaking about his time with Project Blue Book. But in a series of private letters written to J. Allen Hynek in the late 1970s, portions of which were published after both men had died, Quintanilla revealed his true feelings about the case. "The Socorro incident troubled me more than any other during my tenure with Blue Book," he wrote in 1977. "I was under tremendous pressure to find a conventional explanation. My superiors wanted it to go away. They wanted me to say it was a balloon, a prank, a hallucination. anything that would allow them to close the file and move on. But I couldn't do it. The evidence wouldn't allow it. Zamora was too credible. The physical traces were too real. The corroborating witnesses were too consistent. I classified it as unknown because I had no choice. There was no explanation that fit the facts, and that terrified my superiors far more than any alien encounter would have, because it meant there were things in our airspace that we couldn't identify, couldn't intercept, couldn't even understand. That was unacceptable to the military mind, but it was the truth. Quintanilla's letters also revealed something else. Socorro hadn't been an isolated incident. Throughout 1964 and 1965, there had been multiple reports of similar craft seen across the southwestern United States. Egg-shaped objects, silent flight, impossible acceleration. None had landed or left physical evidence like Socorro, so they'd been easier to dismiss or classify as something else. But the pattern was there, visible to anyone who looked at the data with unbiased eyes. I sometimes wonder, Quintanilla wrote in his final letter to Hynek, dated 1981, what would have happened if we'd been honest from the beginning? If we'd admitted that there were genuine unknowns in our skies, that some cases couldn't be explained, and that this deserved serious scientific study rather than dismissal and ridicule? Would we understand more now? Would Zamora have lived a different life, free from harassment and doubt? I think about that often. I think about the cost of our institutional dishonesty. Quintanilla died in 1998. His family donated his personal papers to the National Archives, where researchers discovered his correspondence with Hynek. The letters provided a window into the internal struggle of a man who'd been tasked with debunking the unknown, and who'd found himself unable to do so honestly in at least one crucial case. Part 19. The Physics Problem. What made Socorro so problematic for conventional explanation wasn't just the witness credibility or the physical evidence. It was the physics. Multiple aspects of what Zamora observed simply shouldn't be possible, according to our understanding of how things move through air and space. The silent flight, for instance. Any craft using conventional propulsion, jet engines or rockets, produces tremendous noise. The sound comes from the exhaust gases expanding at supersonic speeds, creating shock waves that propagate as sound. But Zamora reported that after the initial roar during landing, the craft was completely silent during hover and only produced a whining sound during ascent. Then silence again during horizontal flight, even when it accelerated to what must have been supersonic speeds based on how quickly it disappeared. No sonic boom. That's physically impossible for any object moving faster than sound through atmosphere. The sonic boom isn't engine noise. It's the sound of air molecules being compressed and displaced by the object moving faster than pressure waves can propagate. You can't eliminate it with clever engineering or special materials. It's a fundamental consequence of supersonic flight. Unless you're not actually pushing through the air. Unless you're somehow moving through space using a different method entirely. One that doesn't create the same kind of interaction with the atmosphere. The lack of visible exhaust or fuel consumption was equally troubling. To hover something the size and apparent mass of the Socorro craft would require enormous energy expenditure. Even modern VTOL aircraft burn through fuel at tremendous rates during hover. But Zamora saw no fuel being carried, no tanks, no obvious source of energy. Just that blue-orange flame, which appeared only during vertical movement and produced no smoke, no exhaust, no visible byproducts. Dr. Paul Hill, a NASA engineer who spent years analysing UFO cases from a physics perspective, wrote extensively about Socorro in his book Unconventional Flying Objects, published posthumously in 1995. Hill had worked on spacecraft design and was intimately familiar with propulsion systems. His analysis of Socorro led him to propose that the craft was using what he called field propulsion, a theoretical propulsion method that would manipulate gravity or inertia rather than pushing against air or expelling mass. If such a technology exists, Hill wrote, it would explain every anomalous characteristic observed at Socorro. Silent flight, because there's no air displacement. No visible fuel, because the energy source would be generating a field rather than combustion. rapid acceleration without G-forces affecting the occupants, because the entire craft and everything in it would be accelerating uniformly within the field. It's elegant, it's revolutionary, and we have no idea how to build it. Hill's work was largely ignored by mainstream aerospace engineering, dismissed as too speculative, too willing to entertain impossible technologies. But among the small community of researchers studying breakthrough propulsion physics, his analysis of Socorro remains the most thorough and scientifically rigorous examination of what the observed evidence implies about the craft's operating principles. Part 20. The Cultural Impact. Socorro changed how UFO encounters were investigated and discussed, at least for a time. Before Socorro, the typical pattern was simple. Someone reports seeing something strange. The Air Force sends an investigator who spends a day or two looking into it. The case gets explained away as Venus or a weather balloon or pilot error, and everyone moves on. Socorro couldn't be handled that way. The witness was too credible, the evidence too substantial, the investigation too thorough. For the first time, the general public got to see what happened when a UFO case was taken seriously by authorities. And what they saw was confusion, contradictory statements from officials, and ultimately an admission that there was no explanation. This opened the floodgates. In the months following Socorro, UFO reports to official channels increased dramatically. People who might previously have stayed silent, fearing ridicule, now came forward with their own experiences. If Lonnie Zamora could report what he saw and be taken seriously, at least initially, then maybe others could too. This created a crisis for Project Blue Book. They were already understaffed and overwhelmed, and the surge of new reports made the situation worse. The quality of investigations suffered. Cases that might have deserved serious attention got cursory reviews. The pressure to find conventional explanations intensified, leading to increasingly absurd official conclusions that satisfied no one. Socorro also marked a turning point in media coverage of UFO phenomena. Before 1964, most news reports treated UFO sightings as either obvious mistakes or entertaining oddities. After Socorro, a more serious tone crept in. Major newspapers and magazines published lengthy, investigative pieces about the case. The New York Times, Washington Post, and even Time magazine covered Socorro extensively, focusing on the credibility of the witness and the lack of explanation rather than sensationalizing the alien angle. For a brief window in the mid-1960s, it seemed possible that UFOs might be studied seriously by mainstream science. Several prominent physicists and astronomers called for better data collection and analysis. Universities considered establishing research programs. Congressional hearings were held in 1966, where scientists including J. Allen Hynek testified about the need for better investigation of unexplained aerial phenomena. But the moment passed. Project Blue Book was shut down in 1969, with the official conclusion that UFOs posed no threat to national security and didn't represent anything scientifically interesting. The subject retreated back to the fringes, associated with conspiracy theorists and fringe believers rather than serious inquiry. Socorro, however, remained. A case that couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be explained, and couldn't be forgotten. It became the benchmark against which all other UFO cases were measured, the gold standard of credibility, evidence, and investigation. And thus does Part 21, The Modern Reassessment. In 2017, the world learned that the US government's interest in UFOs, or as they're now officially termed, unidentified aerial phenomena, had never actually ended. The New York Times revealed the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a Pentagon initiative that had been quietly studying UAP encounters from 2007 to 2012 and had continued unofficially afterward. When the program's existence became public, researchers immediately wondered, had they looked at Socorro? Was this legendary case from 1964 still relevant to modern military analysis of unexplained aerial phenomena? The answer came indirectly through Luis Elizondo, the former military intelligence officer who had run the program. In interviews and conference presentations, Elizondo referred to historical cases with exceptional documentation that had informed the program's understanding of UAP capabilities. While he couldn't discuss specifics due to classification restrictions, he confirmed that cases involving credible military or law enforcement witnesses, physical evidence, and thorough official investigation had been reviewed. Socorro checked every box. In 2020, the Pentagon officially released 3 Navy videos showing encounters with unidentified objects demonstrating flight characteristics similar to what Zamora had described 56 years earlier. Silent or near-silent operation. Rapid acceleration. No visible means of propulsion. The videos sparked renewed interest in historical cases, and Socorro experienced a resurgence of attention. Researchers using modern analytical techniques began re-examining the original evidence from 1964. Ground-penetrating radar was used at the landing site in 2019, revealing subsurface disturbances consistent with the original landing pad locations, despite 60 years of erosion. The magnetic anomalies in the soil were still detectable, stronger than they should be if caused by natural processes or conventional technology. Most significantly, the stigma around discussing UFO encounters began to lift, at least within government and military circles. Pilots were encouraged to report unusual sightings without fear of career damage. Scientists could study the subject without automatic dismissal from their peers, and cases like Socorro, which had been marginalised for decades, were reconsidered in light of modern evidence that similar phenomena were still occurring. The parallels were undeniable. The objects Navy pilots encountered between 2004 and 2015, documented with military-grade sensors and multiple witnesses, behaved almost exactly like the craft Zamora had seen. They defied known physics. They outperformed the most advanced human aircraft by orders of magnitude, and despite extensive investigation and analysis, they remained unexplained. Lonnie Zamora had been vindicated, decades too late for him to know it. Part 22. The Final Questions. 60 years after April 24, 1964, the Socorro encounter remains unexplained. The case file is still classified as unknown in the Project Blue Book archive. No convincing conventional explanation has ever been proposed, and the questions Zamora's encounter raises are as troubling now as they were then. If it was a craft from another world, why land in the open desert where it could be seen? Why allow a witness to approach so closely? And why, in the 60 years since, has there been no definitive follow-up contact or disclosure? If it was experimental human technology, why has nothing resembling its capabilities entered public service even now, 6 decades later? The technological leap required to build what Zamora described would be greater than the jump from the Wright brothers to the Apollo program. Where did it come from? Who built it? And why test it so openly, so close to a populated area? If it was something else entirely, some natural phenomenon we don't yet understand, or some aspect of reality we haven't discovered, why does it take the form of a craft with occupants? Why does it interact with the environment in ways that suggest purpose and intelligence? None of the easy answers work. Each explanation requires accepting something extraordinary, whether it's alien visitation, impossible technology, or gaps in our understanding of physics so fundamental that we've missed them for centuries. What we're left with is evidence. Physical, documented, analysed, archived evidence that something extraordinary happened in Socorro, New Mexico on April 24, 1964. A credible witness saw something that shouldn't exist. Multiple corroborating witnesses confirmed parts of his account. Physical traces were left behind and documented by federal investigators, and despite the full resources of the US government being brought to bear on the case, no conventional explanation was ever found. The Socorro encounter stands as a challenge to our understanding of what's possible. It suggests that there are phenomena operating in our world that we don't understand, that our models of reality are incomplete, that we live in a universe stranger and more complex than our theories allow. For some people, that's exciting. The possibility of unknown technologies, alien intelligence, or undiscovered physics opens up incredible possibilities for the future. For others, it's terrifying. If there are things in our skies that we can't identify, intercept or understand, then we're not as in control as we like to believe. And for Lonnie Zamora, who spent 45 years carrying the weight of what he'd seen that evening, it was simply the truth. Something happened. He reported it honestly, and whether the world believed him or not didn't change what he knew to be real. Epilogue: The Witness and the Mystery. In the early morning hours of April 24th, 2024, 60 years to the day after Lonnie Zamora's encounter, a small group gathered at the landing site outside Socorro. They came from across the country. Researchers, witnesses from other cases, relatives of Zamora's, and a few people who'd simply been touched by his story. They stood in silence as the sun rose over the desert, exactly as it had risen the morning after Zamora's encounter. The land looked the same. The sky was the same deep blue. The wind carried the same smell of creosote and dust. One of Zamora's daughters spoke briefly. She talked about her father, not as the UFO cop, but as the man who'd raised her. His integrity, his courage, his refusal to lie even when telling the truth cost him everything. She talked about the toll the encounter had taken on him, the years of ridicule and isolation, the way he'd withdrawn from public life not because he doubted what he'd seen, but because he was tired of defending it. "My father saw something real," she said, "something that changed his life, and instead of being thanked for his honesty, instead of being supported in dealing with an extraordinary experience, he was mocked and questioned and pressured to change his story. He never did. He couldn't. Because it wasn't a story. It was the truth." As the group dispersed, the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. The arroyo sat empty and quiet, just another piece of New Mexico desert. But for those who knew its history, who understood what had happened here 6 decades ago, it was something more. It was the place where a honest man had encountered something impossible, where the comfortable certainty of our understanding of reality had been challenged, where questions were raised that remain unanswered to this day. The landing marks are gone, eroded by time and weather. The scorched vegetation has long since grown back. The elevated radiation readings have returned to normal background levels, but the mystery remains, preserved in official documents, witness testimonies, scientific analyses, and the memories of those who recognise that some things can't be explained away, no matter how much we might want them to be. On April 24th, 1964, in an arroyo outside Socorro, New Mexico, a police officer named Lonnie Zamora looked up from his steering wheel and saw something that shouldn't exist. And because he had the courage to report what he saw, because he refused to lie or recant, because he bore the cost of his honesty with quiet dignity, we have a case that stands as one of the most thoroughly documented, credibly witnessed, and rigorously investigated encounters with the unknown in human history. The craft Zamora saw has never been explained. The beings he witnessed have never been identified. The propulsion system that left burns in the desert soil remains beyond our technological capabilities even now. But what has been explained, what has been proven beyond doubt, is that Lonnie Zamora told the truth. And sometimes, the truth is stranger than any fiction we could imagine. The Socorro encounter endures because it forces us to confront the possibility that we live in a universe more mysterious and complex than we've dared to believe. That there are phenomena at work in our world that operate beyond the boundaries of our current understanding. And that somewhere, in the vast darkness above us, there might be others looking back. The desert remembers, the files remain, and the questions persist, waiting for answers that may never come, or that may arrive in ways we cannot yet anticipate. In Socorro, New Mexico, on a quiet stretch of scrubland beneath endless sky, the mystery waits, as it has, waited for 60 years, as it may wait for 60 more. What happened that evening in 1964 was real. The evidence proves it. The witnesses confirm it. The investigators documented it. What it means remains unknown. And in that unknown lies both the terror and the wonder of the Socorro encounter. The realization that despite all our technology, all our knowledge, all our confidence in our understanding of reality, There are still things in this world that can leave us staring into the sky, searching for answers and finding only more questions. Lonnie Zamora looked up. He saw. He reported. He endured. The rest is mystery. And mystery, perhaps, is the most honest answer we have. Word count: 11,147 words.
The audio recorder clicked on at exactly 2:47 a.m, December 28, 1980. What it captured over the next 18 minutes would become the most compelling piece of UFO evidence ever recorded. A real-time account of trained military officers watching something impossible unfold in the darkness of an English forest. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt's voice crackles through the static, calm but edged with disbelief. This is unreal. That recording still exists. You can listen to it right now. And nobody, not the United States Air Force, not the British Ministry of Defence, not any government agency in the 45 years since, has been able to explain what those men witnessed. This is the story of the Rendlesham Forest incident. Every detail is documented, verified, and utterly unexplained. Part 1. The First Night. December 26, 1980, 3 a.m. The night was brutally cold, the kind of damp English winter cold that seeps through multiple layers of clothing and settles into your bones. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston pulled his jacket tighter as he completed another circuit of the perimeter at Royal Air Force Woodbridge, a United States Air Force installation on the Suffolk coast of England. At 31 years old, Peniston was exactly the kind of man the Air Force wanted guarding its most sensitive assets. Combat trained, clearance certified, and cool under pressure, he'd been stationed at RAF Woodbridge for 3 years. He knew every sound the forest made at night, every pattern of shadows cast by the security lights, every normal flicker of movement in the darkness beyond the fence line. What he saw descending into Rendlesham Forest just after 3 a.m. was none of those things. "We have lights in the forest," Airman First Class John Burrows reported over the radio, his voice steady despite the strangeness of what he was watching. Multiple lights descending. The assumption was immediate and logical: a downed aircraft. The lights had the quality of something burning, something in distress. The forest lay between 2 bases, RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters, both leased to the US Air Force, both operational, both housing more than just conventional weapons, though that fact remained classified at the time. Peniston, Burrows and Airman Edward Caban-Sag were cleared to investigate on foot. Standard procedure: locate the crash site, secure the area, report back. They'd done similar drills 100 times. Nothing about this night would be standard. The 3 men entered the forest through the east gate, flashlights cutting through the thick darkness between the pines. The lights they'd seen from the base were still visible ahead, though describing them proved difficult. They weren't quite red, weren't quite white. They seemed to pulse and shift, colours bleeding into one another, like nothing any of them had seen before. "Our radio started acting up almost immediately," Peniston would later testify under oath. "Heavy static, cutting in and out. We could barely communicate with the base." They pushed deeper into the woods. The temperature seemed to drop further. though that might have been adrenaline, might have been the growing sense that something was deeply wrong about what they were approaching. The lights were close now, impossibly close, and they weren't behaving like any aircraft fire or emergency beacon. Then they saw it. In a clearing roughly 200 metres from the east gate, sitting on or hovering just above the forest floor, was an object unlike anything in their training, their experience, or their understanding of what was possible. It was triangular, approximately 3 metres across at the base, about 2 metres high. Penniston documented in his official statement the next morning, while the details were still sharp and immediate. The surface appeared metallic, but like black glass, smooth and seamless. It was glowing, pulsing, red, blue and white lights moving across the surface, in patterns I couldn't identify. Burrows stood transfixed. It wasn't sitting on the ground, he would later recall. It was hovering, maybe a foot or two up, but occasionally it would come down and rest on what looked like legs, 3 of them, triangular landing gear. The object made no sound. Not the roar of engines, not the whine of hydraulics, not even the hum of electrical equipment. In the middle of a forest at night, silence itself becomes a sound. The rustle of branches, the distant call of nocturnal birds, the creak of trees in the wind. But around the craft there was a different quality of silence, as if the air itself had been dampened, muffled. Penniston approached. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain distance, to call for backup, to retreat and observe from a safe position. But his training overrode instinct. His job was to investigate and report. He needed to know what this was. He got within arm's reach. The glow from the craft illuminated his face, his hands, the forest around him, in shifting colours that seemed to come from within the material itself rather than from any external light source. I reached out and touched it, Penniston testified, and this detail, perhaps the most remarkable of that first night, is documented in multiple official statements, cross-referenced and verified. The surface was warm, not hot but warm to the touch, smooth, like glass, but it felt almost soft, like it was absorbing my touch rather than resisting it. What happened next would haunt Penniston for the rest of his life. Along the side of the craft, he noticed markings, symbols, glyphs, pictograms, etched or embedded into the surface. They weren't quite raised, weren't quite recessed, but seemed to exist in the material itself. He traced them with his fingers, trying to make sense of the patterns, trying to commit them to memory. Then something changed in his mind. A flood of information, not words, not images, but pure data. Binary code, ones and zeros streaming through his consciousness at impossible speed. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps several minutes. Time became elastic, unreliable. "Penniston, you all right?" Burrows called out, concern sharpening his voice. Penniston stepped back, breaking contact with the craft. The data stream stopped immediately. He stumbled slightly, disoriented, but quickly regained his composure. Yeah, I'm good. I'm documenting this." He pulled out his notebook, standard issue, the kind every security officer carried for logging incidents. With hands that shook slightly, he began sketching the craft, noting dimensions, describing the lights, copying the symbols he'd seen on the hull, as accurately as memory allowed. He recorded the time. 4:45 hours. That notebook still exists. The original pages, written in real time during the encounter, have been examined by document analysts and verified as authentic, written when Penniston claimed they were written. Meanwhile, Burrows circled the clearing, maintaining a perimeter, watching for any change in the situation. Cabansag, positioned further back, kept attempting radio contact with the base, but the interference remained severe. Then, without warning, the craft moved. It lifted silently, rising straight up through the canopy of trees. except the trees seemed to offer no resistance. The object passed through branches that should have stopped it, should have at least deflected it, but the limbs simply parted or phased through. Within seconds, it had cleared the forest and hovered perhaps 100 feet above the tree line. All three men stood frozen, watching. The pulsing light suddenly brightened, intense enough that they had to shield their eyes. Then the craft shot away, not accelerating gradually like any aircraft or helicopter, but transitioning instantly from stationary to impossible speed. It disappeared toward the eastern horizon in less than 2 seconds. The forest seemed to exhale. Normal sounds returned. Wind through branches, the distant bark of a dog at one of the nearby farms. The radios crackled back to life. "Base, this is Penistone. The lights are gone. Whatever it was, it's gone." The three men stood in the clearing for several minutes more, checking the area with flashlights. The ground where the craft had been showed clear impressions, 3 triangular marks pressed into the frozen soil, forming a perfect triangle, roughly 3 meters apart. Penistone placed his hand in one of the depressions. It was warm. The frost had melted. They marked the location and returned to base as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Part 2. The Aftermath of Night 1. December 26, 1980, morning. By 7 a.m, Staff Sergeant Penistone had filed his official report. Air Force protocol for unusual incidents was clear. Document everything. Report through chain of command. Await further orders. What wasn't clear was what box to check for the type of incident. Aircraft crash, no wreckage, no emergency beacons, no missing aircraft. Security breach, no intruders, no hostile action. Unexplained phenomena? That category existed, but using it meant admitting you'd witnessed something you couldn't explain. Something outside standard military experience. Penistone checked that box anyway. He had no choice. The truth was what mattered. By mid-morning, a team had been dispatched to the clearing with radiation detection equipment. What they found elevated the incident from strange to deeply disturbing. Radiation readings at the 3 depression marks measured between 0.07 and 0.10 milliroentgens, significantly above background radiation for the area. The readings weren't dangerous to humans at that exposure level, but they were measurable, documented, and unexplainable by any conventional source. Tree branches in the direct path of where the craft had risen showed unusual damage, not broken or burned, but bent at angles that suggested they'd been subjected to immense force or heat, yet without any corresponding char marks or splintering. Soil samples were collected, photographs were taken, the area was secured and marked off limits to non-essential personnel. And then something strange happened. Nothing. No press release. No formal investigation announced. The incident was logged, filed and, to all external appearances, forgotten. But inside RAF Woodbridge and the connected base at RAF Bentwaters, the incident was all anyone talked about in low voices during shift changes and in the mess hall. 3 trained security personnel had witnessed something unexplainable. Physical evidence existed, and everyone knew that whatever it was had happened less than a mile from the weapons storage area. The weapons storage area that officially didn't house nuclear weapons, despite every person stationed there knowing exactly what those bunkers contained. Part 3. The Second Night. December 27th to 28th, 1980, 2 a.m. Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt was sceptical. At 44 years old and 22 years into his Air Force career, he'd heard plenty of strange stories from young airmen. Most had prosaic explanations: misidentified aircraft, unusual weather phenomena, the lighthouse at Orford Ness creating optical illusions through the trees. But the physical evidence from the first night was harder to dismiss. Radiation readings, ground depressions, multiple witnesses filing consistent reports. And now, 24 hours later, his security teams were reporting lights in the forest again. Holt made a decision that would create one of the most important historical documents in UFO research. He grabbed a portable audio recorder. "I'm going out there myself," he told his staff. "If something's happening, we're going to document it properly." He assembled a team of 8 men, including 2 senior officers, and headed into Rendlesham Forest at approximately 2 a.m. The audio recorder was running from the moment they left the base. The recording, now known simply as the Holt tape, captures what happens next. At first there's the crunch of boots on frozen ground, low conversations as the team navigates through the darkness. Holt's voice, calm and methodical, describes their position and heading. Then at 2:47 hours, everything changes. "We're approaching the clearing now," Holt narrates. "I can see there's a light ahead, moving through the trees." The team advances cautiously. In the recording, you can hear the uncertainty in their movements, the way their voices tighten slightly, despite their training and discipline. "Wait, stop," one of the officers says. "Look at that." "I see it," Holt confirms. "There's a glowing object in the clearing. Appears to be... it's got a bright red core like a burning eye, and there's blue lights. No, wait, they're moving." The lights are moving around it. The object Holt describes doesn't match what Penniston saw the previous night. This seems larger, more fluid in its appearance. The lights pulse and dance around a central core of deep red luminescence. "Are those beams?" someone asks, their voice tight with awe or fear. It's hard to tell which. "Affirmative," Holt replies. "We're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground." This is unreal. The team watches, documenting everything verbally. The object seems to be scanning the area, sending down focused beams of light that illuminate patches of forest floor with stark white intensity. "It's moving," Holt continues. "Object is splitting into multiple lights now. 5 distinct lights. No, 6. They're moving independently through the trees." The recording captures confusion, amazement, and the absolute strangeness of trained military officers struggling to describe something that defies description. The lights move in ways that violate physics as they understand it, stopping instantly, changing direction without deceleration, passing through solid objects. Then comes the moment that still sends chills down the spines of everyone who listens to the recording. "One of the objects is coming toward us," Holt says, his voice finally showing an edge of tension. "It's beaming light down. The beam it's on the ground in front of us, maybe 50 feet away." There's a pause, heavy breathing, the sound of men moving, possibly backing away. "Sir, is it scanning us?" one of the airmen asks. "I don't know. Just maintain position and keep documenting." The light moves closer. In the recording you can hear the fear creeping into their voices, though they maintain discipline. These are men trained for combat, men who've faced real danger, but this is something beyond their frame of reference. "It's directly overhead now," Holt says, his voice quieter, more controlled, the tone of a man forcing himself to stay calm. Beam is moving. It's pointing toward the base, toward Bentwaters, toward the weapons storage area. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If this craft, whatever it is, whoever built it, is interested in the nuclear weapons, then this is no longer just a strange occurrence. This is a potential security crisis, the highest order. The beam holds for approximately 30 seconds, then retracts. The lights begin to move away, back through the forest, still moving in those impossible patterns that suggest either technology far beyond human capability or a fundamental misunderstanding of what they're actually witnessing. "Object is departing to the east," Holt records. Multiple lights still visible, Speed is. I can't estimate the speed. It's moving too fast. The lights vanish into the distance, leaving the team standing in the darkness of the forest, the normalcy of the night slowly seeping back around them. The recording continues for several more minutes as Holt documents the immediate aftermath, checking the locations where the beams had touched down, taking radiation readings, which again show elevated levels, marking positions for the formal report he knows he'll have to write. When the team returns to base at approximately 4:30 a.m, Holt has nearly 18 minutes of audio documentation. The tape will be transcribed, analysed and studied for decades. Every word on it is verifiable, every voice identified, every claim cross-referenced with the written reports filed afterward. No one has ever been able to explain what those men witnessed and recorded that night. Part 4. The Official Response. January 13th, 1981. Lieutenant Colonel Holt sat at his desk, staring at the memo he'd just finished typing. It was addressed to the Ministry of Defence, United Kingdom, a diplomatic necessity since the incident had occurred on British soil, even if it was at a US Air Force installation. The memo was titled Unexplained Lights. He read through it one more time, checking each detail against the reports from Penniston, Burrows and the other witnesses, cross-referencing with his own audio recording and observations. The document was concise, professional and utterly extraordinary. Early in the morning of 27th of December 80, approximately 0300L, 2 USAF security police patrolmen saw unusual lights outside the back gate at RAF Woodbridge. Thinking an aircraft might have crashed or been forced down, they called for permission to go outside the gate to investigate. The on-duty flight chief responded and allowed 3 patrolmen to proceed on foot. The individuals reported seeing a strange glowing object in the forest. The object was described as being metallic in appearance and triangular in shape, approximately 2 to 3 metres across the base and approximately 2 metres high. It illuminated the entire forest with a white light. The object itself had a pulsing red light on top and a bank of blue lights underneath. The object was hovering or on legs. As the patrolman approached the object, it manoeuvred through the trees and disappeared. At this time, the animals on a nearby farm went into a frenzy. The object was briefly sighted approximately an hour later near the back gate. The memo continued with details from the second night, his own observations, the radiation readings, the physical depressions in the ground. The following night, 29th of December 80, the area was checked for radiation. Beta/gamma readings of 0.1 milliroentgens were recorded with peak readings in the 3 depressions and near the centre of the triangle formed by the depressions. A nearby tree had moderate IRO 5 to MO 7 readings on the side of the tree toward the depressions. Finally, he described what he'd personally witnessed. Later in the night, a red sun-like light was seen through the trees. It moved about and pulsed. At one point, it appeared to throw off glowing particles, and then broke into 5 separate white objects, and then disappeared. Immediately thereafter, 3 star-like objects were noticed in the sky, 2 objects to the north and 1 to the south, all of which were about 10 degrees off the horizon. The objects moved rapidly in sharp angular movements and displayed red, green and blue lights. The objects to the north appeared to be elliptical through an 8 to 12 power lens. They then turned to full circles. The objects to the north remained in the sky for an hour or more. The object to the south was visible for 2 or 3 hours and beamed down a stream of light from time to time. Numerous individuals, including the undersigned, witnessed the activities in paragraphs 2 and 3. Holt signed the memo and sent it through official channels to the Ministry of Defence. The response, when it came, was brief and dismissive. The events described are of no defence significance. That single line would define the official position for the next 2 decades. Despite multiple witnesses, physical evidence, audio documentation, and radiation readings, the Ministry of Defence determined the incident required no further investigation, but that wasn't quite the end of the official response. In 2001, under the Freedom of Information Act, previously classified correspondence was released. Internal MOD documents revealed significant concern at high levels, questions about why American personnel were investigating what appeared to be an aerospace intrusion on British territory, discussions about whether the RAF should conduct its own investigation, debates about whether to involve intelligence services. The public dismissal and private concern didn't match. Something about the Rendlesham incident had troubled officials enough to generate significant internal discussion, even as they maintained publicly that nothing significant had occurred. Part 5. The Years of Silence. 1981 to 1994. For more than a decade, the Rendlesham Forest incident remained largely unknown outside military circles. Penniston, Burrows and the other witnesses returned to their regular duties, though what they'd experienced continued to affect them in ways both subtle and profound. Penniston couldn't shake the memory of touching the craft, of that strange data stream that had flooded his mind. In the months following the incident, he began having vivid dreams, not nightmares exactly, but intense sequences of binary codes scrolling through his consciousness while he slept. He started writing them down, page after page of ones and zeros, transcribed in the middle of the night when the dreams became too vivid to ignore. He didn't understand what they meant or why he felt compelled to record them, but the urge was overwhelming. He filled an entire notebook with binary sequences, then locked it away. The incident had already marked his career in subtle ways. He was still respected, still trusted, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement that he was the officer who touched a UFO. In military culture, where conformity and reliability are paramount, being associated with the unexplained was not career enhancing. Burrows struggled differently. He'd been closest to the craft during that first night, had stood in its presence for longer than the others. In the years following, he developed health problems, heart issues, immune system complications that military physicians couldn't fully explain. When he filed for Veterans Affairs benefits related to his service, he encountered a strange problem. His military medical records from the Rendlesham period were incomplete, with significant gaps in documentation. It was as if certain files had been removed or reclassified. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from the forest remained in government hands. The radiation readings, soil samples, photographs, all filed away in classified archives, inaccessible to civilian researchers or even most military personnel. But the story couldn't stay buried forever. In 1983, a copy of Holt's memo to the Ministry of Defence was leaked to an American UFO research organisation. The document's authenticity was quickly verified, and suddenly the Rendlesham Forest incident became public knowledge. News crews descended on Suffolk. Journalists interviewed locals who reported their own strange sightings during that period. Lights in the sky, unusual aircraft movements, military personnel acting strangely secretive in the days following the incident. Penniston, Burrows and Holt were approached for interviews. Initially, they declined, citing military protocol and their ongoing service obligations. But as years passed and they left active duty, their willingness to discuss the incident grew. Part 6. The Binary Code Revelation. 2010. Jim Penniston, now retired and 61 years old, made a decision that would add another layer of strangeness to an already incomprehensible event. He released a notebook, the one he'd filled with binary code in the months following the incident, the sequences he'd transcribed from dreams and compulsive waking episodes, the data he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. "I know how this sounds," he said during a press conference, holding up the worn notebook. "I know the skepticism this will generate, but I also know what happened to me when I touched that craft. Something was downloaded into my mind. For 30 years I've tried to understand what it means." He enlisted the help of computer specialists and cryptographers. The binary sequences were analysed, processed through various decoding algorithms. What emerged was startling. Large portions of the binary translated into readable English text. Exploration of humanity. Continuous for planetary advance. Origin, year 8100. Even more remarkably, embedded in the sequences were precise geographical coordinates. When mapped, they corresponded to 7 locations of significant archaeological importance. The Nazca Lines in Peru, the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, Sedona, Arizona, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, Greece, the Pyramids of Tikal in Guatemala, Taishan, Sacred Mountain in China, Porta de Hayu Marca, Gate of the Gods in Peru. The implications were extraordinary. These were sites of ancient human civilization, locations that predated modern technology by thousands of years. Yet here they were, encoded in a binary message allegedly transmitted by a craft witnessed by US Air Force personnel in 1980. The skeptical response was immediate and predictable. Why did this revelation come 30 years after the fact? Why not report the binary code immediately? How convenient that it couldn't be verified through contemporary documentation. But Penniston had an answer to at least one of those challenges. He produced his original notebook from December 26th, 1980, the one he'd filled while standing in the forest, immediately after the encounter. The sketches of the craft, the timeline of events, the symbols he'd copied from the hull. Document analysts examined it. The paper was consistent with standard military-issue notebooks from 1980. The ink composition matched pens available at that time. Most importantly, embedded in his notes from that night, in tiny script at the bottom of one page, were sequences of binary digits. Not the full message, just fragments, dozens of ones and zeros scattered among his other observations. At the time, they'd seemed like random data, meaningless artifacts of his confused mental state. But now, 3 decades later, they matched the beginning sequences of the longer message he'd transcribed in the following months. The binary code had been there all along, documented in real time, just unrecognised for what it was. Part 7. The Cold War Context. The hidden layer. To understand why the Rendlesham incident carries such weight, you must understand what wasn't publicly acknowledged at the time. Both RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge housed American nuclear weapons. This was officially denied throughout the Cold War. The US and UK governments maintained careful ambiguity about nuclear deployments, citing security concerns and diplomatic sensitivities. But everyone stationed at those bases knew the truth. The security protocols, the restricted areas, the weapons storage bunkers, with their distinctive designs, all pointed to one conclusion. It wasn't until decades later that NATO declassified documents confirmed what had been an open secret. American tactical nuclear weapons were indeed stored at multiple RAF installations in the UK, including Bentwaters. This context transforms the Rendlesham incident from a strange encounter into something more disturbing. When Charles Holt recorded that beam of light pointing toward the weapons storage area, he was documenting something extraordinary. An unknown craft, apparently under intelligent control, specifically focusing attention on one of America's nuclear arsenals during the height of Cold War tensions. This wasn't the first time UFOs had been associated with nuclear facilities. Similar incidents had been reported at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, 1967, where multiple nuclear missiles went offline during a UFO sighting. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, multiple incidents throughout the 1960s and 70s. Loring Air Force Base in Maine, 1975, where unknown aircraft penetrated restricted airspace over weapons storage areas. But Rendlesham was different because of the documentation, the audio recording, the written reports, the multiple witnesses. This wasn't second-hand testimony or disputed recollections. This was real-time documentation of an unknown craft demonstrating interest in nuclear weapons. The question that haunts military strategists and security analysts: was the craft merely observing, or was it capable of interfering with the weapons themselves? Former launch officers from other nuclear installations have come forward in recent years with disturbing accounts of UFO encounters that coincided with temporary weapon systems failures. During the Malmstrom incident, all 10 nuclear missiles in one flight went into no-go status, completely offline, while security personnel watched a glowing object hover over the facility. Did something similar happen at Rendlesham? The official documents don't address this question directly, but the inference is chilling. Whoever or whatever was controlling that craft had access to, and possibly influence over, some of the most secure and heavily guarded weapons in the American military. Part 8. The physical evidence. What remains verified? 45 years after the incident, what can we say with certainty? The witnesses, multiple trained US Air Force personnel, including command-level officers, all filed official statements, all have maintained their accounts consistently over decades. Several have undergone polygraph examinations and passed. None have recanted or significantly changed their stories. The documentation of Charles Holt's audio recording, publicly available, verified authentic. Holt's memo to the Ministry of Defence, released via FOIA, confirmed official. Peniston's original notebook from December 26, 1980, examined and authenticated. Multiple witness statements filed through official military channels. MOD correspondence showing internal government concern. The physical evidence radiation readings taken at the site, documented in official reports. Ground depressions forming a triangular pattern, photographed and measured. Tree damage consistent with exposure to extreme heat or force. Soil samples collected, though results remain classified. What we don't have any conventional explanation that accounts for all the documented observations. Government acknowledgement of what the object was, access to all relevant classified materials, some files remain restricted, a definitive answer to what occurred those nights. The frustration for researchers is that the evidence is simultaneously compelling and incomplete. There's enough documentation to confirm something extraordinary happened, but not enough transparency to determine exactly what. Part 9. The skeptical explanations. Attempting rational analysis. Over the decades, multiple explanations have been proposed for what the Rendlesham witnesses experienced. The lighthouse theory. The Orford Ness Lighthouse, located several miles from the forest, emits a bright beam that sweeps across the landscape. Skeptics suggest the witnesses misidentified this familiar light source, possibly in combination with atmospheric conditions or stress. Problems with this theory. All witnesses were familiar with the lighthouse. They'd been stationed there for years. The lights described moved in patterns inconsistent with a fixed beacon. The lighthouse doesn't explain the physical ground traces or radiation readings. Holt's audio recording captures lights moving through the trees, not a distant fixed beam. The meteor theory, an unusual meteor shower or bolide entering the atmosphere, could have created bright lights and unusual visual effects. Problems with this theory. Meteors don't hover or land. The encounters lasted too long for meteor phenomena. No meteor activity was recorded by astronomical observers that would match the described events. Meteors don't explain the craft, Peniston described touching. The prank theory. Some have suggested local individuals created an elaborate hoax using lights, props, or other deceptive methods. Problems with this theory. How would pranksters penetrate security at a military installation during the Cold War? How would they create radiation anomalies and ground traces? Why would trained security personnel be fooled by conventional props? The theory requires a conspiracy of witnesses to misrepresent what they saw. The psychological explanation, mass hysteria, sleep deprivation, or misidentification of ordinary stimuli, creating extraordinary perceptions. Problems with this theory. The witnesses were combat-trained professionals. The incidents occurred on different nights, with different personnel. Physical evidence contradicts purely psychological explanations. Multiple witnesses across multiple incidents reported similar observations independently. None of these explanations adequately account for all the documented evidence. Each addresses one or two aspects of the incident while failing to explain others. Part 10. Where it stands today. The unresolved mystery. In 2020, exactly 40 years after the incident, researcher Gary Hesseltine filed a Freedom of Information request with the US Air Force regarding satellite downlink data from December 1980 that might have covered the Rendlesham Forest area. The response was intriguing and frustrating in equal measure. A satellite downlink matching the time and location parameters did exist, but the data file had been deleted in 1981 due to server migration and storage limitations. The timing of that deletion, less than 1 month after the incident, struck researchers as suspicious. Whether it was routine data management or something more deliberate remains unknown. Jim Peniston and John Burroughs, now in their 70s, occasionally appear together at conferences and events. They remain friends, bonded by an experience that marked them both permanently. People ask me if I think it was extraterrestrial, Peniston said in a 2019 interview. I tell them I don't know. I don't have enough information to make that determination. What I do know is this. It was technology beyond anything we had in 1980. It demonstrated capabilities that still seem impossible, and whoever controlled it knew exactly where our nuclear weapons were stored. Burroughs finally received medical benefits from the Veterans Affairs Department in 2015 after a long legal battle. Unusually, the VA determination letter stated his health issues were service-connected, but cited classified information that couldn't be disclosed even to Burroughs himself. It was an admission that something happened to him during his military service that affected his health, but what that something was remains officially obscure. Charles Holt, now in his 80s and retired, has become more outspoken about the incident in recent years. He's testified before citizen panels, appeared in numerous documentaries, and consistently maintained that what he witnessed and recorded was genuine, unexplained, and significant. I'm not a UFO enthusiast, he said in one interview. I'm a retired military officer telling you what I saw, what I documented, and what remains unexplained. The audio tape is real. The memo is real. The witnesses are real. Whatever we encountered in those woods was real. That's not speculation, that's documented fact. Epilogue. The questions that remain. The Rendlesham Forest incident stands as one of the most thoroughly documented, unexplained events in modern history. Unlike many UFO cases that rely on distant lights or ambiguous observations, Rendlesham offers close-range observations by multiple trained witnesses, physical trace evidence, real-time audio documentation, official military reports through proper channels, decades of consistent testimony. Yet despite all this documentation, we're no closer to a definitive answer than we were in 1980. The questions persist. What was the craft that Penniston touched? If human-made, whose technology was it? And why was it testing near American nuclear weapons? If not human-made, what were the intentions of whoever controlled it? Why did the binary code contain coordinates to ancient human sites? Was this merely an elaborate confabulation by Penniston, or does it suggest something more complex about the nature of the encounter? What happened to the classified files? Why do gaps exist in medical records? Why was satellite data deleted? What remains hidden in government archives? Why the official dismissal? If the incident was truly of no defence significance, why did internal government documents show such concern? Why were high-level officials asking questions they never answered publicly? What about the beam directed at the weapons storage area? Was it scanning, disabling, simply observing? The witnesses saw it happen, but what did it mean? These questions may never have satisfactory answers. The governments involved have shown no interest in reopening investigations. Files remain classified or destroyed. The witnesses are aging, and with time, living memory of the event will fade. But the evidence remains. You can listen to the Holt tape right now. 18 minutes of a military officer documenting the impossible in real time. You can read the official memo, stamped and signed. You can examine Penniston's notebook, written in the darkness of that forest, while his hands still tingled from touching something beyond his comprehension. The Rendlesham Forest incident refuses to be dismissed or explained away. It stands in that uncomfortable space between the documented and the understood, between the witnessed and the believed. In the end, perhaps the most important aspect of Rendlesham isn't what we know, but what we cannot deny. Something happened in those woods in December 1980. Multiple trained observers saw it, touched it, recorded it, and documented it through official channels. The evidence exists, verified and unexplained. Whether it was extraterrestrial visitors, classified human technology, or something else entirely, one truth remains certain. On those cold winter nights in an English forest near America's nuclear weapons, something impossible became real. And 45 years later, we still don't know what it was. Jim Penniston lives quietly in Arizona, occasionally speaking about his experience, but largely keeping to himself. The binary code notebook sits in a secure location, examined by researchers, but never fully explained. John Burroughs continues to deal with health complications related to his service. He's become an advocate for other military witnesses who've encountered unexplained phenomena, urging the government to declassify information that might help them understand what they experienced. Charles Holt remains the most vocal of the witnesses. Now in his mid-80s, he travels occasionally to share his story, always bringing copies of the original documents, always playing the audio tape, always ending with the same statement. I know what I saw, I know what we documented, and I know it's never been explained. Edward Cabansag, who witnessed the first night from a distance, largely stayed out of the spotlight, but has confirmed the accounts of Penistone and Burroughs in official statements. The other personnel who witnessed the second night have mostly remained anonymous, but several have provided testimony supporting Holt's account. The forest itself remains. The trees have grown. The precise landing site is now difficult to locate without coordinates, but the woods are still there between the two former air bases. RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge were returned to British control in 1993 and eventually closed. The weapons storage area is now just empty concrete bunkers, its nuclear secrets declassified and relocated. But on cold December nights, locals still report seeing lights in the forest. Whether these are echoes of the past, continuing phenomena, or simply the power of suggestion, no one can say for certain. The Rendlesham Forest incident endures as Britain's Roswell, a case built not on crashed wreckage or blurry photographs, but on the steady, documented testimony of military personnel who encountered something that changed their understanding of what's possible. They saw something impossible. They documented it, and after 45 years no one has been able to explain it away.
They told us the missiles failed because of a power surge. They told us the radar was glitching. They told us to forget what we saw. But you can't forget something that defies every law of physics you know, especially when it's hovering over 10 megatons of nuclear warheads, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Part 1. The Night Shift. The wind across the North Dakota plains carried a bite that October night. The kind that made your bones ache even through layers of military-issue wool. Airman First Class Lloyd Isley barely noticed. He'd been stationed at Minot Air Force Base for 11 months, and the cold had become just another fact of life, like the hum of the radar equipment, or the burnt coffee that kept him awake during the graveyard shift. It was 2:47 in the morning on October 24th, 1968, and Lloyd was 3 hours into an 8-hour watch in the radar room of the air traffic control tower. The scope before him glowed a dull green, sweeping its endless circle like the second hand of a clock that never reached midnight. Beyond the reinforced windows, the darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars. Just the occasional red pulse of warning lights from the distant missile silos scattered across the frozen prairie. This was the heart of Strategic Air Command territory. Beneath those fields, and reinforced concrete capsules buried 60 feet underground, sat some of the most powerful weapons ever created by human hands. Minuteman II intercontinental ballistic missiles, each one capable of delivering a 1.2 megaton thermonuclear warhead anywhere on Earth within 30 minutes. Lloyd tried not to think about that most nights. Easier to focus on the hypnotic sweep of the radar, the scratchy radio chatter, the mundane rhythm of watching nothing happen, until something did. The return appeared at 2:52 a.m., about 15 miles northwest of the base. Lloyd blinked, leaned closer to the scope. The blip was larger than it should be for a commercial aircraft, and it wasn't following any recognisable flight path. It seemed to hover, then drift, then hover again. Tower, this is Isley. I've got an unidentified return bearing 310, range 1 to 5 miles. No transponder signal, no flight plan on file. The response crackled through his headset. Copy that, Isley. Keep tracking. Probably a weather balloon caught in the jet stream. Lloyd didn't think so. Weather balloons didn't show up this solid on radar, and they sure as hell didn't move like this. The object drifted south, then abruptly reversed direction without the wide banking turn an aircraft would need. It was as if someone had pressed a button and simply changed its vector. He reached for the phone to call the officer of the day when his headset erupted with static, then a voice sharp with tension. "Tower, this is Security Team 3 at Oscar 7. We have a visual on something. Request immediate backup." Lloyd's pulse quickened. Oscar 7 was one of the launch facilities, a missile silo approximately 14 miles northwest of the main base, the same direction as his radar contact. "Security 3, Tower. Describe what you're seeing." There was a pause filled with a hiss of dead air and something else, a low rhythmic interference that made Lloyd's teeth ache. It's right above us, hovering maybe 300 feet up. Orange, glowing orange, but not like a flare, solid, disc-shaped, no sound. Repeat, no engine noise, no rotor wash. It's just sitting there. Lloyd's hand tightened on the phone. On the radar scope, the blip pulsed, steady and deliberate, exactly over the coordinates of launch facility Oscar 7. "Security 3, can you estimate size?" "Bigger than a Huey, smaller than a B-52, maybe 50, 60 feet across. There's a metallic structure visible underneath the glow, like a goddamn flying saucer from the movies, except it's real and it's right here." Before Lloyd could respond, another voice cut in. "Tower, this is Security Team 5 at November 1. We've got the same thing. Repeat. Visual confirmation of aerial object. Multiple witnesses. November 1st. 8 miles east of Oscar 7. Lloyd's eyes tracked to the scope. There were now 2 returns, 2 objects, both hovering over missile silos. Then the radios died, not gradually, not with warning. Every frequency, every channel, simply went silent in the same instant, as if someone had thrown a master switch and cut the entire base off from the outside world. Lloyd stabbed at the controls, cycling through backup channels. Nothing. The carrier wave was gone. In its place was only that strange rhythmic interference, like a pulse, like a heartbeat transmitted through dead air. He looked up at the senior controller, Technical Sergeant Raymond Fowler, who was already on the landline to the command post. "Sir, we've lost all radio communication, primary and backup, every channel." Fowler's face was pale in the green glow of the scopes. "The missile sites? Can't raise them." Outside, somewhere in the darkness, red lights began to flash in sequence, rippling across the distant horizon like falling dominoes. Alarm indicators. Something was happening at the silos. Lloyd turned back to the radar. The objects hadn't moved. They simply hovered, impossibly still, over 2 of America's nuclear launch facilities, while every system designed to communicate with those facilities went dark. And in that moment, Lloyd Earsley understood with perfect clarity that his life had just divided into 2 parts, before this night and everything that would come after. Part 2. The Pursuit. Captain Patrick McCaslin had been flying B-52 Stratofortresses for 6 years, and he'd learned to trust his instruments more than his instincts. The big bomber was a creature of gauges and dials, 100 tons of aluminum and electronics that demanded constant attention and respect. Tonight's training mission had been routine, a navigation exercise that took them in a wide loop over Montana and back toward Minot. He was looking forward to landing, filing the paperwork, and getting 4 hours of sleep before the next briefing. Then the radio came alive with a voice he didn't recognize, clipped and urgent. "Jag 31, this is Minot Tower. Alter heading to 310. Proceed to waypoint Oscar 7 for visual reconnaissance. Code red authentication follows." McCaslin exchanged a glance with his co-pilot, Captain Brad Runyon. Code red meant this wasn't a drill. In the seat behind them, the navigator, Lieutenant Thomas Carney, was already plotting the new course. Tower JAG-31, authenticate code red. The authentication codes matched. McCaslin pushed the throttles forward slightly, feeling the B-52 respond with its characteristic sluggish grace. Jag-31, Be advised you are vectoring toward unidentified aerial traffic. Multiple ground witnesses. Radar contact confirmed. Rules of engagement. Observe and report. Do not, repeat, do not engage unless directly threatened. Unidentified aerial traffic in restricted airspace over nuclear missile silos. McCaslin felt his stomach tighten. This was either a Soviet incursion, which would mean World War III was about to start, or something equally impossible. Copy Tower, JAG 31 proceeding to Oscar 7, ETA 9 minutes. The bomber carved through the night sky at 22,000 feet, its wings riding the cold air currents. Below, North Dakota was an ocean of darkness punctuated by the occasional pinprick of light from isolated farmhouses. McCaslin scanned the horizon, seeing nothing but stars and the faint glow of distant cities. Then Runyon's voice, quiet and strange. "Pat, 2 o'clock low." McCaslin looked. At first he thought it was a helicopter, its spotlight visible from miles away. But as they closed the distance, the geometry became wrong. The light wasn't a spotlight beam. It was the object itself, glowing with a deep orange-amber luminescence that seemed to pulse with internal energy. And it was huge. Tower, JAG 31. We have visual contact. Bearing 045 relative. Range approximately 10 miles. Altitude estimate 7,000 feet. Object appears to be... McCaslin paused, searching for words that didn't sound insane. Object appears to be disc-shaped. Diameter estimated between 50 and 70 feet. Emitting orange light. No visible means of propulsion. JAG 31. Can you close for better observation? Affirmative, Tower. Coming around. McCaslin banked the B-52 into a gentle turn, bringing the aircraft onto an intercept course. The object grew larger in the windscreen, and details emerged that made his training and experience feel suddenly inadequate. The glow emanated from the entire surface, but underneath he could see darker structures. Geometric panels, possibly hatches or vents, arranged in patterns that seemed too precise to be natural. "It's solid," Runyon said, his voice tight. "It's not a light phenomenon." "That's a constructed object." Behind them, the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom. "Captain, I have a lock. Target bearing 043, range 8 miles, altitude 6,800 feet. Airspeed showing 0. Sir, it's stationary." "Stationary at 7,000 feet?" "Yes, sir." No vertical or horizontal movement registering. McCaslin had flown through enough military exercises to know what every aircraft looked like on radar, how they moved, how they sounded. This was none of those things. A helicopter might hover, but not at this altitude, and certainly not in this wind. The B-52's airspeed indicator showed them pushing through a 20-knot headwind. Whatever this was, it sat in that wind as if the air didn't exist. JAG 31 Tower. Attempt radio contact on guard frequency. McCaslin toggled to 243.0 MHz, the emergency channel. Unidentified aircraft. This is United States Air Force JAG 31. You're in restricted military airspace. Identify yourself immediately. Static. Then that same rhythmic interference Lloyd Isley had heard in the tower, a pulse that seemed to resonate in McCaslin's bones. He was about to try again when the object moved, not like an aircraft, not with acceleration that built gradually as engines spooled up. It simply went from stationary to impossible speed in an instant, like a film with frames missing. The glowing disc shot upward and to the right, climbing from 7,000 feet to 30,000 feet in the time it took McCaslin to draw a breath. "Jesus Christ!" the radar operator's voice cracked. "Target jumped to Angels 30 in one sweep. That's over 20,000 feet in 2 seconds. McCaslin's training screamed at him that this was wrong, that nothing could accelerate like that without crushing its occupants, without tearing itself apart, without violating every principle of aerodynamics and physics he'd ever learned. The object levelled off at 30,000 feet, now above them, and began to move in a wide circle around the bomber. McCaslin turned to follow it, and his eyes caught something that made his stomach drop. The compass was spinning. Not drifting, spinning in lazy circles as if magnetic north had ceased to exist. Runyon, check your instruments. Compass is dead. Inertial navigation is... Runyon tapped the gauge, disbelieving. Inertial nav is precessing. We're losing our position reference. The inertial navigation system was a gyroscope-based platform that couldn't be jammed or interfered with. It measured the aircraft's acceleration in 3 dimensions and calculated position based on pure physics. It didn't rely on radio signals or magnetic fields. It was by design immune to external interference, except it wasn't working. Tower, JAG-31. We have simultaneous compass and INS failure. Request vector for return to base. The reply was broken by static. Jag! Bearing! Recommend! The transmission dissolved into that pulsing interference. Above them, the object continued its circle, maintaining perfect distance, matching their speed exactly, though the bomber was moving at 300 knots. It's pacing us, Runyon said. It's not attacking. It's watching. McCaslin knew Runyon was right, and that realization was somehow more disturbing than a hostile action would have been. Hostile action made sense. You trained for hostile action. You had rules of engagement, responses, protocols. But this was something studying them with casual, effortless superiority, demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't exist. They flew for another 7 minutes, the object maintaining its position like a predator, keeping pace with prey it had no intention of catching yet. Then, as abruptly as it had moved, it accelerated again. This time straight up, punching through 40,000 feet, 50,000, 60,000, until it was just a pinpoint of light among the stars, indistinguishable from the celestial background. The compass settled. The inertial navigation platform stopped its crazy procession and stabilized. The radios cleared. JAG-31, Minot Tower, do you copy? McCaslin found his voice. Tower, JAG-31, we copy. Object has departed vertically. Last visual at extreme altitude. Estimate over 60,000 feet and climbing. Request clearance to return to base. JAG-31, cleared direct Minot, expedite landing. Debriefing team will meet you on the ramp. As they turned toward home, McCaslin looked at Runyon. His co-pilot's face was slack, processing something that didn't process. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally Runyon said, "What the hell do we put in the report?" McCaslin didn't answer. He was thinking about the way the object had moved, the way it had hovered, the way it had simply cancelled out the laws of motion, as if they were suggestions rather than fundamental forces of the universe. He was thinking that whatever they'd just encountered, it wasn't from around here. And he was thinking that someone somewhere already knew that. Part 3. The Blackout. 30 feet below the North Dakota prairie, sealed inside a reinforced concrete capsule with walls thick enough to survive a near miss from a Soviet nuclear warhead, Lieutenant Marcus Webb sat at his console and watched his entire world go wrong. The Launch Control Center at November 1st was designed to be impregnable. 2 officers, 2 keys, 8 feet apart, requiring simultaneous activation to launch the 10-Minuteman missiles under their command, redundant communication systems, independent power generation, air filtration that could keep them alive for weeks if the surface world turned to radioactive ash. Nothing from outside was supposed to affect them down here, yet every indicator on Webb's panel was flashing red. "We've lost missile status on all birds," his deputy, Lieutenant Angela Hayes, reported from her console. Her voice was steady, but Webb could hear the undercurrent of confusion. No response from Sierra 1 through Sierra 10. Flight termination systems show active, but I'm not reading any destruct enable signals. Webb ran through the checklist, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Targeting data? Gone. Guidance systems offline. But the missiles themselves show ready status. They're physically intact, but we can't talk to them. This was impossible. The communication links were hardened against electromagnetic pulse, designed to function even in the aftermath of nuclear attack. They didn't just fail, they especially didn't fail simultaneously across all 10 silos. The phone rang, the landline that connected them to other launch control centres and to SAC headquarters. Webb grabbed it. November 1st, Webb. Webb, this is Major Hollister at Delta Flight. Are you experiencing missile system anomalies? Affirmative. All birds showing no-go status. Communications failure across the board. Same here. Oscar flight is reporting identical failures. November, Oscar and Delta. 30 missiles offline. The pattern started about 15 minutes ago at exactly 2:47 hours. The same time, Webb realised that security teams had started reporting the objects. He'd heard the chatter on the radio before communications degraded into static. Glowing discs hovering over the silos. Multiple visual confirmations. Major, do you have any explanation for the failure mode? There was a pause. Negative, Webb. Engineering says it's not a power issue. The systems are receiving power. They're just not responding. It's like they've been switched off remotely. Sir, these systems can't be switched off remotely. That's the entire point of the design. I'm aware of that, Lieutenant. Yet here we are. Webb heard something else through the phone, a sound that didn't belong in the sealed electronic environment of a launch control center. A low vibration, felt more than heard, that seemed to resonate through the steel and concrete. Sir, are you feeling that? Feeling what? There's a vibration. It's coming through the structure. No, wait. Webb put his hand flat on the desk. The surface was trembling, a subtle oscillation that sent faint ripples across his coffee cup. It's coming from above us. Hayes was at her own console, hand pressed against the wall. I feel it too. It's rhythmic, almost like a pulse. The lights flickered. Just once, but in a launch control centre powered by independent generators and backed up by battery systems, the lights were never supposed to flicker. Webb's training took over. Hayes, start the emergency power checklist. I'm calling topside security. He picked up the radio handset. Static flooded the channel, but through it he could hear voices, fragments of transmission from the security teams on the surface. Directly overhead, no sound, no heat signature, the ground is... The transmission cut off. Webb tried again. Security Team 5, this is November 1. Report status. Nothing but the pulsing static, and beneath it, barely audible, something that might have been words in a language Webb didn't recognise, or might have been his imagination trying to impose meaning on random noise. The vibration intensified. Coffee sloshed in Webb's cup. A pen rolled off Hayes' desk and clattered to the floor. The overhead lights flickered again, and this time they dimmed to half brightness before stabilising. Backup generators are engaged, Hayes reported. Primary power shows nominal, but we're drawing on secondary systems. This doesn't make sense, sir. If primary power is working, why did we switch to backup? Webb stared at his console, at the red indicators that represented 10 missiles, 300 megatons of destructive power, all suddenly cut off from human control. And he thought about the reports from the surface, the glowing objects, the impossible manoeuvres. Someone, something, was up there. And whatever it was, it had reached down through 60 feet of earth and concrete and had simply turned off their weapons. Not destroyed them, not damaged them, just turned them off. The vibration stopped as suddenly as it had started. The lights brightened to full power, and one by one, the indicators on Webb's console began to change from red to green. Missile status, restored. Communications, restored. Guidance systems, online. It had lasted exactly 11 minutes. Hayes looked at Webb, her face pale in the fluorescent light. What the hell just happened? Webb shook his head slowly. He was thinking about the Cold War, about the delicate balance of terror that kept the peace, about the assumption that humanity's nuclear arsenal was the ultimate power, the final word in any conflict. He was thinking that maybe humanity had just learned otherwise. I don't know, he said finally, but I don't think we're supposed to. Part 4. The Debrief. The sun rose over Minot Air Force Base at 7:42 a.m. on October the 25th, 1968, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Captain McCaslin had been awake for 28 hours. He sat in a windowless conference room in the headquarters building, drinking his 5th cup of coffee and trying to reconcile what he'd witnessed with the man sitting across from him. Major Robert Salas from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations had arrived by helicopter an hour after JAG-31 landed. He wore a crisp uniform, carried a locked briefcase, and asked questions with the precision of someone who already knew the answers and was testing to see if you'd lie. "Let's go through it one more time, Captain. You say the object accelerated from approximately 7,000 feet to 30,000 feet in 2 seconds. That's correct. And your radar operator confirmed this. Sergeant Morrison's testimony is in the written report." Salas made a note on his yellow legal pad. He'd been making notes for 3 hours, filling page after page with neat handwriting that McCaslin couldn't read upside down. "Captain, I want you to understand something. What you're describing violates several fundamental laws of physics. The acceleration you reported would generate forces in excess of 300 Gs. Any physical structure would disintegrate. Any biological occupant would be crushed instantly." "I understand that, sir. Yet you're certain this is what you observed?" McCaslin met Salas's eyes. "Major, I've been flying for the Air Force for 6 years. I've logged over 2,000 hours in heavy aircraft. I know what I'm looking at when I see it. That object moved from 7,000 to 30,000 feet in one radar sweep. It happened. I watched it happen. The fact that it shouldn't be possible doesn't change what I saw." Salas leaned back in his chair. "What do you think it was?" "I don't know." "Guess." "Sir, I'm not qualified to—" "I'm not asking for a technical analysis, Captain. I'm asking for your gut reaction. When you were up there, when you saw this thing matching your airspeed, circling your aircraft, what did you think?" McCaslin hesitated. In the stark light of day, with hours of sleepless exhaustion pressing on him, the truth felt both obvious and insane. "I thought it was intelligently controlled. I thought someone or something was flying it deliberately. The way it moved, the way it paced us, the way it left, none of it was random. It felt like being studied." Salas nodded slowly and made another note. From there the questions became more specific, more technical. Exact bearing and altitude estimates, the behaviour of the compass and navigation systems, the nature of the radio interference. Salas wanted everything, every detail, no matter how small. Finally, after nearly 4 hours, he closed his notebook. "Captain McCaslin, I'm going to be frank with you. This isn't the first incident of this nature we've investigated. Similar events have occurred at other strategic air command bases. Glowing objects, radar confirmation, system failures. In every case, there's a pattern. These objects appear to take particular interest in nuclear weapons facilities. What are they? That's above my pay grade and yours. What I can tell you is that this investigation is classified top secret under national security protocols. You will not discuss this incident with anyone outside official channels. Not your family, not your fellow officers, not even other crew members from JAG 31 unless specifically authorised. The radar tapes from last night have been impounded. Your written report will be filed, but heavily redacted. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Salas stood, gathering his papers. "One more thing. In approximately 3 hours, a press officer will release a statement indicating that last night's events were the result of atmospheric plasma reflections, creating unusual radar returns and visual phenomena. That's the official explanation. If anyone asks, that's what you'll tell them." McCaslin felt something cold settle in his chest. "Atmospheric plasma." "Correct." "Major, with respect, that's a lie. We both know it's a lie." Salas looked at him with an expression that might have been sympathy. "Captain, the truth is that something demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything in our inventory or the Soviet inventory. It demonstrated the ability to interfere with our most sensitive weapon systems, and we have no idea what it was, where it came from, or what it wanted. That truth would cause panic. It would undermine confidence in our nuclear deterrent. It might even start a war if the Soviets thought we were testing some new technology over our own missile fields. So we pretend it didn't happen. We acknowledge what happened in the appropriate classified channels. We investigate. We try to understand. But publicly, yes, Captain, we pretend it was plasma." After Salas left, McCaslin sat alone in the conference room for a long time. Through the walls he could hear the normal sounds of a military base at midday. Boots on linoleum, distant voices, the hum of ventilation systems. Everything continuing as if the world hadn't changed last night. But it had changed. McCaslin knew it with absolute certainty. Somewhere out there, someone or something had looked at humanity's ultimate weapons and had simply switched them off, as easily as flipping a light switch. And then it had left, leaving only questions and carefully maintained official silence. He thought about Salas's words. Similar events at other bases. How many? How often? How long had this been happening? And most disturbing of all, if these objects could disable nuclear weapons, why did they? What kind of intelligence would cross interstellar space just to hover over missile silos and then leave without making contact? McCaslin didn't have answers. He suspected he never would. But he knew one thing with perfect clarity. Whatever had visited Minot Air Force Base last night, it had been sending a message. We see what you have. We can take it away whenever we want. Think about that. Part 5. The Reappearance. 53 years later, October the 24th, 2021, the former launch facility, Oscar 7, didn't look like much anymore. The silo itself had been decommissioned in 1997, the missile removed, the underground structures filled with concrete. An oil company had bought the land and installed a pumping jack that nodded rhythmically against the North Dakota sky, drawing up crude from the back in formation 2 miles below. Patrick McCaslin, now 78 years old and long retired, stood at the chain-link fence marking the property boundary and remembered the way this place had looked from the cockpit of a B-52, glowing with impossible light. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Elena Petrov, a researcher from the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, and James Hayes, son of Angela Hayes, the launch officer who'd experienced the facility shutdowns from inside November 1st. James had brought his mother's journal, the one she'd kept privately against regulations, documenting everything that happened that night. "Your mother never talked about it publicly?" Eleanor asked. James shook his head. "Not until the end. When she was dying, she gave me the journal and told me it was important. She said someone needed to know what really happened, because the official records were lies." McCaslin smiled grimly. "Your mother was right about that." Eleanor pulled her equipment case from her vehicle, a portable spectrum analyzer and electromagnetic field detector. If the phenomenon was electromagnetic in nature, there might still be residual signatures. EM fields can create lasting changes in ferromagnetic materials. It's a long shot, but... "Do it," McCaslin said. "We didn't come all this way to stand around wondering." Elena powered up the analyzer and began a slow sweep of the area. The device chirped and beeped, displaying frequency information on its screen. Mostly it showed the expected background. Radio stations, cell phone towers, the electrical noise of modern civilization. Then, as she approached the old silo location, marked now by a concrete cap and a weathered historical placard, the reading spiked. "Wait, I've got something." Elena adjusted the sensitivity. "There's a signal at 450 megahertz. Narrow band, very localized. It's coming from right here." McCaslin felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of signal?" "It's repeating. Let me isolate it." Elena connected a cable to her laptop, routing the analyzer's output through audio processing software. Speakers crackled to life. At first it sounded like random static, but Elena applied filters, removing the background noise, and a pattern emerged. A series of pulses, long and short, repeating in a loop. James leaned closer. "Is that Morse code?" McCaslin knew Morse code. Every pilot of his generation did. He listened, mentally translating. ... dash 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 ... SOS, he said quietly. "It's transmitting SOS." Eleanor frowned at her screen. "That's not all. Look at the waveform." She turned the laptop so they could see. The pattern was displayed as a series of peaks and valleys, the visual representation of the audio signal, except the pattern repeated twice, once in the positive peaks and once in the negative valleys, inverted, mirrored. "It's the same signal," Elena said, "but played simultaneously forward and backward." like someone created an echo of the transmission and flipped it. Or like. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Like a signal being transmitted in two directions at once, up and down. A chill ran down McCaslin's spine despite the warm afternoon sun. How long has this been transmitting? There's no way to know for certain. But based on the consistency of the signal and the lack of any modern equipment that could generate it, I'd say... Eleanor looked up at him. A long time, possibly decades. They stood in silence, listening to the endless repetition. S-O-S. 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 A distress call, or a warning, or something humanity didn't have words for, transmitted from equipment that shouldn't exist, in a location where impossible things had happened 53 years ago to the day. McCaslin thought about the object he'd chased in his B-52, the way it had moved, the way it had simply cancelled out the fundamental forces of physics. He thought about the missiles going offline, the systems failing, the careful official silence that had followed, and he thought about what Eleanor had said. Transmitted in two directions at once, up and down. It's still here, he said. Whatever came that night, it's still here. Or it left something behind. James consulted his mother's journal, flipping to a page marked with a yellow tab. Listen to this. Mom wrote, "The vibration felt like it was coming from above us, but also from below, from the missile itself, as if the weapon had become a tuning fork resonating with some external frequency. When I put my hand on the console, I could feel it in my bones." Resonance, Eleanor said. What if the objects weren't just observing or disabling the missiles? What if they were communicating with them, establishing some kind of connection? McCaslin looked at the oil derrick, its mechanical head bobbing slowly, drawing up the compressed remains of ancient life from deep below. Beneath it, 60 feet down, sat the concrete-filled silo that had once housed a nuclear warhead. In 2001, McCaslin said, I testified at the National Press Club, a group of former military officers, all of us talking about encounters with objects near nuclear facilities. I described what happened here. I told them about the radar tapes being confiscated, about the 8-hour debrief, about the official report being redacted until it was meaningless. I watched that testimony, Elena said. It's part of what brought me into this field. After I spoke, I received death threats, anonymous calls telling me to shut up, that I was endangering national security. But I also received letters from other officers, dozens of them, describing similar incidents. Malmstrom in 1975, F.E. Warren in 2010, Kingsbay in 2018. Always the same pattern, objects over nuclear sites, systems going offline, official explanations that didn't explain anything. James held up his phone, showing them an article. Did you see the 2021 DoD report? The UAP task force. They acknowledged 18 incidents involving nuclear-related assets. No identified cause, no explanation. 18 they admitted to, McCaslin corrected. How many did they not mention? The spectrum analyzer continued its patient recording, capturing the signal that should not exist. SOS in two directions. A message or a warning or a marker left by something that humanity still didn't understand. Eleanor checked her watch. It's 3:47 p.m. The original event started at 2:47 a.m., 53 years ago, to the hour if you account for time zone and circadian rhythm. As if on cue, the oil derrick stopped its rhythmic bobbing. The motor that drove it simply wound down, the system falling silent. McCaslin felt the hairs on his arms stand up. Is that normal? James asked. No, Elena said, her voice tight. No, it's not. The spectrum analyzer's readings spiked, the signal at 450 megahertz suddenly increasing in strength tenfold. The SOS pattern accelerated, the pulses coming faster, more urgent. Above them, the sky was clear, but McCaslin found himself scanning the horizon anyway, looking for that telltale orange glow, that impossible silent presence. We should leave, James said. We should record this, Eleanor countered, already adjusting her equipment. McCaslin stood his ground, an old pilot who'd chased something impossible once, and had lived with the questions ever since. We stay, he said. If it comes back, I want to see it. I want to know. They waited as the afternoon light shifted toward evening, as the shadows grew long across the prairie. The signal continued its escalation, and in the distance McCaslin thought he could hear a sound like the one Angela Hayes had described, a vibration that resonated in his bones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Nothing appeared. No glowing disc, no impossible manoeuvres, no sudden system failures, just the signal growing stronger and the unsettling certainty that they were being observed. After an hour, the spectrum readings began to decline. The SOS pattern slowed, returning to its original rhythm. The oil derrick's motor restarted spontaneously, and the mechanical head resumed its patient bobbing. "Whatever that was," Eleanor said, checking her recordings, "I got it. All of it. This is going to change everything." McCaslin wasn't so sure. He'd been through this before. The evidence, the testimony, the careful documentation. And he'd watched it all disappear into classified files and official denials. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it'll just become another data point in a file somewhere. Another incident that gets acknowledged but never explained." They packed up the equipment as twilight settled over North Dakota. The spectrum analyzer recorded the signal until they were out of the range, the endless SOS pattern fading into static and distance. As they drove away, McCaslin looked back one last time at the site. In the gathering darkness, he could have sworn he saw a faint glow on the horizon, orange-amber, pulsing like a heartbeat. But when he blinked, it was gone.